Warning, this podcast contains scenes of explicit nonsense and lore.
Previously on the Resident Evil podcast.
Can't really imagine this voice actor using that voice to ask Chris to make him a cup of tea in the Star's office.
One of the biggest things about these remakes that perhaps is a bit of a cheat and also a bit of a loss is that it's less trailblazing to have so many remakes, really, in the sense that you're just rehashing old ground until you're reinventing parts of it and so forth.
Jumping chandeliers? Seriously? Who does that? Bang, 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 bang. Gun rhymes with fun for a reason, stranger.
Hello, stranger. I was chunked out my fucking skin. I wasn't expecting to do that.
The Resident Evil Podcast.
Hello and welcome to episode 87 of the Resident Evil podcast. More troublesome than some black water in rural Spain, and the only coronation we will attend is for the new king of the Indopire tribe. I'm Nick, better known as Neptune. Let's see who's joining us today. He's defeated the Joker, Riddler and Catwoman, but what about the remake continuity? It's the Batman.
Hello there.
Some say his exposed heart is what makes him a loving and caring individual. For others, it's a clear target for his imminent destruction. It's Stars Tyrant.
Hello there.
And he's been in the RE community longer than the undead from the Tall Oaks catacombs. It's Romby.
Hello! And that's
Coming
also
up-
very true.
Coming up on today's podcast, we'll be finishing our look at the excellent Resident Evil 4 remake with our deep dive into its lore. Specifically, we're looking at the in-game narrative, the new elements that have been added to the tale, and trying to work out what fits, what doesn't, and whether it's a general improvement over the lore of the original Resident Evil 4. We'll also be catching up on some news that we missed from last time before ending with another edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. So let's start with that news. Not too much news in this podcast. The first bit comes from Death Island. Oh yes, so we are rapidly approaching the release of Resident Evil Death Island, and it's been shown that a home release is coming, perhaps unsurprisingly, and I think there's a pre-order up on Amazon France. 2nd of August looks to be the date a home release is coming, and that's certainly in 4K UHD, which is very nice indeed, because Infinite Darkness did not get a 4K release, neither did Vendetta in PAL regions. Put that in your diary. We're getting ever closer to Death Island, folks. With Remake 4 kind of passing, is this something to get excited about? I am, but that's just me, because it's got a shark. We like the shark. What about you guys?
I'm interested to see the dynamic of the returning characters, yeah.
I just don't have confidence after the last couple. I suspect that it'll be an interesting story, but relatively standalone and potentially pointless. But hey, whatever. I'm still going to watch it.
We're going to watch it, and we're going to hope and pray. As I said, with all these animation
Who knows? I might get surprised.
none of them are, well, I mean, Vendetta's pretty woeful, but none of them are terrible. But I think as fans, especially when we've got the big four together for the first time, plus, Rebecca, we want something pretty good, don't we, John?
We do, but I think history has taught us that's not what we're going to get. It's nice that they're finally doing this big Avengers-style team-up with all the main cast, and as Sean said, it's the little individual character moments. That's going to be the highlight for me. I watched the trailer again this morning, actually, just randomly, and it just looks like an absolute hot mess. I'm really not expecting much from it at all.
We don't dwell on it too much, because obviously we're doing our review in August as well, but I think with a lot of them, even with Infinite Darkness and Vendetta, there's little moments of, kind of that slow-paced, mansion-esque, intrigue that could work really well. And they just go, nah, I'll do it, and they just throw it away for the bombastic nature of the animation. We understand why, but, they could change it up a little bit.
I mean, with exception to the Tyrant battle in Damnation for obvious reasons, and parts of the Curtis fight in Degeneration, my single favourite moments from each of these projects has just been the quiet character moments, like with Leon and Claire in Degeneration, Chris's chat with Rebecca in the hotel room. It's the character moments that I'm on board for, and Infinite Darkness, as an example, had painfully little of those because of how Claire was sidelined and whatnot. In fact, the most interesting piece of the movie was actually their scene together at the end.
Mm.
So hopefully, I can switch my brain off at the pirouetting and Jill wall running like Alice and stuff like that, and just hopefully get some good character drama. And then the rest of the movie can do what it likes. I'll apply the sort of same mindset that I do to Resident Evil 6, where when it's just about characters talking, it's great. And when it's, snowmobile chases down avalanches, I couldn't care less.
Last bit of news, sales figures. Oh yes, as always, we like to keep people posted. But more importantly, Capcom have updated everyone with what they have described as their best quarter ever. Quite remarkable figures. Their total sales, I think, was up from 32 million to 41 million sales in a quarter, which is unbelievable.
No, it's a fiscal year, not quarter.
Fiscal, yes, in the fiscal year. 80.3% of sales overseas now in the Western Hemisphere, which is unsurprisingly Capcom's IP, especially things like Monster Hunter, as well, has gained a lot of traction abroad, which is great for Capcom. But on a negative side, from my point of view, specific sales figures of physical media is now only 10.6%.
Yeah.
That is disgraceful.
It is, and you can fight the tide, but I don't think there's anything we can do now. Unfortunately, I will mourn it, and I'll still, support physical as long as I can. But even I'm not naive. I know its time will be up soon. It's just the relentless war on plastic now. I think that's going to do it. When you just look at, is there really a need to develop cases and discs when you can just do it all digitally?
And then it cuts down on the shipping and stock holding and all the physical elements of exactly. So it's like digital's got a lower carbon footprint, and it's a feature that obviously companies like Microsoft have been pushing for a decade now. So
I do believe Resident Evil 2 Remake is very close to overtaking RE7 as the top-selling title ever, isn't it?
Yeah, if you take it as a single release, that is true. But then obviously if you combine all the unit sales of various games, I think Resident Evil 5 is technically the one that sold the most of all titles still. It's if you combined it all the versions that it came on. So it depends on your outlook. But as a single release, it is super close. It's probably one more. We get an update sales quarter, I guarantee it's probably overtaken it. And I think Alex and Neil said the same thing.
Well deserved. It's two great games at the top.
Even all the games, 7's still selling too, as well, which is just crazy. I think it's sold in another 300,000 units, which is just nuts. Remakes both sold pretty well. Even 3, as much as people don't say it's a great remake, it's obviously still considered a good game, and they both sold north of 500,000 in that time. So yeah, I think it is. And we know Resident Evil 4, the sales covers was only a week, I think, of its launch. So, and we know that later on they updated the amount past 4 million. So we know that the next report's going to definitely push 4's remake through quite a higher number as well. So yeah, Capcom will be obviously very happy with that. They've had 10 years of consistent growth, 8 with profitable, just amounts. It's just an insane, the company has never done any better, and it was the highest number of sales total for any year. Just insane.
At risk of sounding like an absolute shill, this just makes me so happy. It makes me so happy because Capcom have long been my favourite developer, and you stick with companies through their worst years, and if we sort of rewind the clock back 10 years, they weren't in a great place, even in the fighting game division with the Street Fighter Cross Tekken scandal with the DLC being on the disc and everything like that. They've come a long way since those years. And as a lover of Street Fighter, and obviously there's Street Fighter 6 on the horizon, it makes me so happy to actually see a company that have taken feedback on board and, actually giving people what they want and look at it just, converting into sales. It's you look at other companies that struggle, Square Enix going down there, absolutely nonsense NFT avenues and things like that. And here's Capcom just being a video game developer, and look how well they're doing as a result of it. It's heartwarming.
You look at something like Konami, same thing, went down the pachinko gambling machines entertainment route, and it's only now I think they realized we could have been growing both at the same time, which is why they started to put a push into things like the Silent Hill 2 remake and so forth.
The great thing with it as well is it's not just pushing live service games or multiplayer only experiences. The Resident Evil games are still absolutely well done single player packages that work out the box. They don't really require massive day one patches or anything like that. It's commendable. Do you think, Rob, you've probably got more experience than most of us here, do you think, though, that bigger companies will look at these results and maybe think, wouldn't they be a perfect lineup for a buyout? If it were Microsoft, couldn't we hoover up this company and look at all this bank we could get?
It's a scary thought, and it has obviously been rumoured before. I think the thing that will be its saving grace is usually when that sort of thing starts to happen, if there are outsiders who've got an invested interest into spending money, especially Saudi money. Like, I know that sounds crazy, but there's a lot of investment from Saudi countries into gaming development. What they tend to do is diversify their portfolios into game companies that are doing well. So if they'll look at Capcom and go, if something's going to buy it out and they see that it's potentially going to make it worse, they'll go and invest money to keep the game company independent, which has happened in the past. And even companies themselves will do that. Like Ubisoft's a perfect example of just like making sure that they continue to raise funding and capital and push on people to invest in the company to stop it from being bought out at times. So I think it's one of those cases where I think Capcom's in a good position, and it would be a risky endeavour for someone to. Yeah, but then the flip side is if you're doing poorly as well, it's not at gets bought out either, unless there's a worth in the IP value. So I think the other interesting thing about this is tracking is that in an industry state, and this is something also you've got to be aware of, is like just the impact that they will have. It's funny because I've never really thought about it until maybe a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about the legacy impact of, say, Resident Evil 4 in the industry, right? And we're talking about that wholly as the impact that game had on the industry. This is another impact on the industry. Like, I hadn't thought about it in these terms until 2 weeks ago. I was like, as I said, I don't think any company has ever made this many from the ground up remakes, and they've all done pretty well. And even though Resident Evil 3 was not as critically well loved as 2 and 4 has been, it's still selling. It's still financially viable, and it's still part of a train of remakes. And we've then seen this knock-on effect of Dead Space remake and Silent Hill 2 and stuff. And so this industry thing will be that more remakes are coming, where the benefit is that they take it and look at it and go, right, we're going to make it from the ground up properly and see how it goes, rather than just putting out a very basic crash grab remake like the HD era of PS3, where we got these HD ports, and a lot of them were just terrible because there was no love or care into it. They've realized the sales are where we spend the money, and so I think it's going to be interesting few more years of seeing what other remakes get made.
Maximo!
Yeah, from a Capcom perspective as well, they've got exactly a huge, and Nick's pulling up what I'm about to say, which is that a huge IP base of games that they haven't touched. And so if they run out of Resident Evil games to remake, I suspect we won't be surprised to start seeing them go, hey, we're going to make these other remakes of these other games because they're catalog IP and we can grow them again. So Dino Crisis and stuff like that start with something that's connected to Resident Evil in some respect, but isn't Resident Evil. And if that does well, and start making more remakes of other titles, and see where it goes.
It probably wouldn't be unfeasible to think you might get a Devil May Cry 1 remake in the RE engine.
That's the scary thought. I was thinking to myself about this as I keep going, where's the Resident Evil remake train going to end? Well, that will probably end eventually. They'll run out of games to remake for a while. But that doesn't mean Capcom can't remake or re-establish other IP. So, be very interested to see where the future of the company goes after all these sales. Capcom has still the ability to remake, let's say, 3-4 of these Resident Evil titles. But let's be completely honest. Code Veronica, 0, the Resident Evil 1 remake could be remade again. And 5. Those are the more obvious 4 titles that people would pick out. I think the internet's clamoring over the idea of 5, but obviously there's a vocal base about Code Veronica. I'll be very interested to see what they make next.
Poor old Survivor gets untouched.
I think Capcom's clearly just focusing on mainline titles. We've noticed this. And the versions we've got have been... It's not like they're going to turn around and make Umbrella Chronicles, Darkside Chronicles remake, because the narrative is mostly side stories and retelling of other games that they've already just remade. So why would you do something like that? And Survivor is, what does that mean to anyone? You can make an amazing Survivor game, but I don't think they're interested in those narrative side stories as much. When was the last time we had an actual proper true side story game?
Absolutely, yeah. It is Umbrella Corps, which doesn't really count. So it's Revelations 2.
Yeah.
That does finish all the gaming news. We quickly move over to our site news, where we say thank you to our new patrons who have joined us since the last podcast. So a big shout out and thank you to Something Valentine, Ghost, Damien Poe, and 2 Count Carl. Thank you so much for your support. If anyone is interested in joining Patreon, then you can head over to our website, click on the community tab, and you should find a button to go to our Patreon to see what benefits it brings. Thanks to Batman, we have updated the lore room. So there's a new translation on the website of Biohazard 4 Incubate, which is a DVD that came out in Japan. So it's kind of like a cinematic DVD of all the cutscenes from RE4 in a DVD package, which was great. But the important thing was the booklet that kind of came with it, which basically, as most people would say, did you like the end credit sequence in the original Resident Evil 4? Yes, you did. Then you will like the story, because it's basically that, with some history and, of what's going on in there, and some villagers, having a nice tranquil life, and then Los Illuminados turning up and screwing everyone over, basically. But John, you've delved into that. Anything you wanted to add about it? Anything listeners and, visitors of the website would want to pick up on?
Not really. There's no, major revelations or anything in there. It's written by a villager called Rodrigo, who sketches different images of the village and talks just about everyday life. It's about the village's gradual descent into the Los Illuminados taking over and infecting them all with the parasite. We all know how much the ending sequence of the original game resonates with people, and if you read these journal entries, it just resonates that little bit more. It just talks about how simple life is in the village, and all they're bothered about is just family and friendship and, all those simple values, and just how it all gets completely taken away from them. They're all just taken in by this cult and this parasite, which they genuinely believe is going to help them reach salvation or whatever. So yeah, it's just a nice little bookend to the original game and just puts some meat on the bones to the story, because as we all know, there was very little in the original game. So I would urge people to give it a read, certainly.
I think that's everything from OG Resident Evil 4 or Biohazard 4 we've now got in the lore room.
Yeah, pretty much. We've got quite an extensive catalogue in there now. I don't really think we're missing anything important. So yeah, if you are interested in supplemental lore for the OG Resident Evil 4, then I would certainly suggest having a look in there, because there is plenty of nice little tidbits, which again adds meat to the bones to the story, which is always a good thing.
And confirmation that Gaiden is canon. Not strictly true.
Yeah.
If one wants to
not
interpret
strictly
that
true.
way, there's confirmation that Barry and Leon were part of a little anti-umbrella organisation, which is good enough for me. I don't know about you.
Good enough for your head canon. No,
Absolutely,
really.
absolutely. By the time this podcast comes out, there may be some more additions to the lore room. John, we've got some other things we're working on. I'll be adding them to the website as soon as possible. But there's some more supplemental material from Remake, Biohazard 2002.
Yeah, so the next section we're going to focus on is Remake, as you say. We've got full translations of Wesker's report, the newest version that was released with the HD remaster. We've got Wesker's report 2. We've got translations from the Biohazard Kaita Shinsho, which has lots of supplemental material, lots of extra information on the creatures, the virus, and, sort of overview of what's going on in the background of the mansion incident. A couple of other guidebooks, and the Samurai Edge story as well, which obviously tells the history of Joe Kendo and his involvement with the STARS team, and goes into a little bit of history of how the STARS was formed and a sort of timeline from inception up until the mansion incident. So hopefully we'll get all that finished in the next couple of weeks, and it should be out sometime by the end of May.
Fantastic. Yes, keep an eye on our socials, because we'll advertise when they are available. That does finish all our site news, so we now turn our attention to the main discussion of the podcast. We're taking that deep dive into Remake 4 and its lore.
Prostrate yourself. This is our holy body. Our divine providence and soul. Such profound lesson for all. Lost Plaga. Welcome, my children. I am Osman Sadler, the speaker for our Lord.
Tell someone who gives a shit.
Foolish lambs, why do you deny grief? Now, abandon your body. Obey the voice of our Lord. Sweet child, do not resist. Pray forgive these wicked sinners. My faithful disciples shall deliver to you your penance. Now, child, you need not be afraid. Submit your body and release yourself from fear.
So here we are again. In this final part of Remake 4 coverage, we are looking at the ever thorny issues of the lore added to a particular remake. What I want to do is basically indicate that this podcast discussion is going to be quite focused on the lore within the game. So we plan to do more of an overview podcast in the future, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this discussion. But we're going to be focusing on the new additions that have built up. So historically, Resident Evil 4 was criticised, wasn't it, for being quite separate from the wider canon when it came out. It was very much, in all intents and purposes, a reboot. And apart from Leon and Ada and Wesker, it was quite separate from, at that point, the main line. But thankfully, things changed, and Resident Evil 5 in particular really dragged Resident Evil 4 into the canon, kicking and screaming, some might say. Separate ways, of course, from the original also helped enormously. So what I think a lot of people thought, and to an extent it's done, and this is what we're going to kind of be focusing on. Remake 4 had this kind of unique opportunity of actually developing the game without a burden of lore behind it, because historically, as I said, there hasn't actually been a huge amount of lore with Resident Evil 4. So 2 and 3, I think we discussed when Remake 2 was first announced. Well, how are they going to do this? There's been about 500 games that have gone to the RPD. What about its geography? Are they going to mention the Outbreak characters? Is the statue going to be moved? Are they going to put the gas in? All this kind of stuff. And we thought, how are they going to, try and tie that all in? And of course, they just didn't even try. Remake 4, from its base was like, well, the actual story of Los Illuminados is so self-contained. They could run in any direction they wanted to. And as we know, they kind of kept it quite faithful. But they did add quite a lot of new interesting tidbits, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, just some brief impressions from everyone here. We'll start with Batman. Do you think the additions have been good for the series, or for this particular game? Do you think the story is more fleshed out now, and does it feel a little bit more cohesive than the original did when it came out?
Absolutely, for me. I think you sort of hit the nail on the head there, because the original game wasn't burdened with all this massive lore behind it like the Raccoon City games was. We were all terrified of various retcons and mistakes cropping up, and Resident Evil 4 Remake was refreshingly free of all that. It could basically do what it wanted to, and the original game was so bare bones, it was hard to see really where they could go wrong. All they had to do was really flesh out the characters, give us some background on the village and backstory on what's happened prior to the Plaga taking over, background on the Salazar family, make us care about, villains like Sadler by showing us a bit of history with his family and obviously the origins of the Los Illuminados, and this game did all that, and for the most part I think it's done it really well. From a lore point of view, this game is probably in my top 5 in the series now. I'm really pleased with what they've done. Some of the changes, yes, they're obviously going to jar with games going forward, the likes of Resident Evil 5 with the certain changes they've made to the Plaga, but the changes they have made, even though they don't necessarily correlate with what's going to come with later games, the changes actually make sense for me. It never really made sense why Sadler was the uber leader in the first game if his parasite was no better than the likes of Salazar, Krauser and Mendez. They all had the same Plaga, but for some reason Sadler was the de facto leader and none of them could do anything about that. They've obviously changed that by having Sadler, he's the only one who has a dominant species Plaga, which makes sense. Then they've created this superior species Plaga, which is basically just a subordinate Plaga, but it doesn't take over the host's brain, which means you retain your free will. That makes sense, because in the original game you'd think, well, if everyone was infected and they've sort of regressed, how have they managed to develop all these really complicated bioweapons, things like the Regenerator and the Novistador? How have they done that if they're all infected with subordinate Plagas and they lose all the minds? the superior species Plaga has now addressed that, so that makes sense. The individual character moments, Leon, this feels like a proper sequel to Remake 2. Leon has properly progressed as a character now. Leon in the original Resident Evil 4 was absolutely fine, but it didn't really feel like it was the same character from the original Resident Evil 2. Whereas Remake 4 Leon, it's naturally the same character from Remake 2 Leon. It just feels like he's naturally grown. So for the most part, I'm really pleased. The only thing I was disappointed by was Krauser potentially not being aligned with Wesker or Ada anymore. I mean, it could still well turn out that is the case once Separate Ways comes, but from what we've seen so far, he appears to be completely committed to the Los Illuminados. And obviously the changes with Operation Javier, things like that I didn't like because they were just so unnecessary. The changes didn't benefit the plot, whereas the changes with the Plaga did benefit the plot. So for the most part, yeah, I'm really, really pleased with what they've done.
The good news is that we'll be covering all that in even more detail in that brief introduction. Thanks, John.
Sorry.
Love it.
Sorry.
Romby, what about you? Where do you see this fits for you in terms of the overall kind of lore improvement or more of the same?
No, I'm kind of with John in the sense that, it's interesting to see the changes, and I think the bits that have kind of been fleshed out are kind of more interesting and kind of explain things. But obviously then I'm just as confused by things like the Operation Javier. It seems an unnecessary change because it doesn't benefit anything in the game seemingly, unless they feel like it just gave more motivation for Krauser directly for the circumstances that it seems just to be him and not connected to Wesker and Ada. So they thought, well, we need to explain this, and so they changed it. But it doesn't seem to be the right change. I think if the narrative had stayed the same, it still would have made sense. I think this is the thing that I've always had with all the remakes. It's a case where, I really think that by design, remakes give you the opportunity to really cohesively connect things and kind of create a narrative continuity within themselves that improves, able to basically retcon on all the problems and make new connections. And I think that's the one failure that across all these remakes, and 4 includes that. We obviously treat the first game as you've well introduced, it was relatively standalone, and it wasn't until later when sequels and DLC concepts and stuff started to come through that you could start to go back and fill in the gaps. But you had that right from the start with these remakes, and yet I feel like Capcom has actively avoided connecting things a lot more than they have, and 4 does probably more connections than anything to its other titles in that sense, but it still kind of holds itself back. And if you look at 2, it was you had a real good opportunity to combine 2 and 3's narratives here, a lot more like crossover. And yet, if anything, there's less than there was between even the OG 2 and 3, because Jill doesn't go back to the RPD and you have less narrative follow through. 4 does the same thing. You had every perfect opportunity to go, right, well, we've got this universe now and this stuff that we have reason to connect this game to. And yet, again, they kind of just hold back on doing that. And I think that's probably my biggest frustration with these from a law perspective is when you get the nitty gritty details and there's more details, it's cool and it's awesome. But I mean, I'm not as much of a canon stickler as some people, and that's no slight against anyone who is. But I do like the idea of narrative cohesion, that there's a continuity and that there's it doesn't have to be all perfect, and I don't expect everything to line up, but you've got this perfect opportunity to create and delve into a connective tissue that basically builds a universe, and it feels like these remakes, and including 4, have actively avoided some of that. But at that same point, 4 is probably the least offender of them. It's the one that's more narratively true to its original. It's embellished and improved on certain areas. Very few of it, what was in there has been reduced, and if so, it's summarized in a way that feels suitable to the summarization of sections of the game. So yeah, I don't know, it's a tough one, and it'd be an interesting conversation ahead.
I think that's an interesting point, and I think, and I'm going to include Village as well in this, I think Capcom spends a lot of time thinking about how to make the in-game storyline as cohesive as possible. So John's examples are quite good. They thought, oh well, Krauser's perhaps a bit difficult to work out. Let's just make him a Los Illuminados. That makes sense within the storyline. They've put that backstory in, and it's just made it a better product in terms of what they're going for within the game. I can't help but feel that when connecting to the wider universe, Capcom may be a little bit lazy and cheap with their connections, in that they think, oh, we better chuck something in there. I'm referring to Lewis being part of the Nemesis program, which by itself, I go, that's fine. Absolutely, it makes perfect sense. But we could expand upon it, or we could just chuck a photograph in and keep everyone happy. Oh, we like the idea that the village in Village is very old and Spencer visited here. Should we explain too much? Oh, no, chuck a photograph and he just walked by and go, I like that symbol. It feels like, I don't know, I have no evidence. It just feels that there's a lot of pressure on getting the in-game storyline better, which I think they do. And as I agree with John in what he's saying about Remake 4 is structurally better, narratively better, right across the board. But when it comes to doing what you said, Rob, that kind of wider bits, it's all a bit, it feels like last minute, quick, what are we going to do? And it's almost illustrated in a law room, isn't it? Let's be honest. It's their new go-to thing. It's just, quick, put something in. I don't know. That's how I feel. But, I mean, you could say Village is arguably a worse perpetrator for it, because that's proper mainline, whereas the remakes, we're not quite sure what they're trying to do yet with the remakes in terms of its overall canon. We'll talk about that in a future podcast. But I don't know. I think they concentrate so heavily on the in-game storyline, quite rightly, and then the last bit seems to be,
And that's, I think, the thing that's frustrating to me is that I can see that there's actually thought process and effort put in to those sorts of things. And yeah, it seems like, as I said, narratively, remakes give you this opportunity to go back and put more ties in or smooth things out so that there's a consistency across them, and it seems to be the avoidance. It's like there's some reason. I don't think it's like laziness. I don't think it's that. I think there is a conscious decision on trying to make sure that these remakes, while they're part of a universe, are kind of almost treated standalone. I mean, narratively, you could compare that to even the animated CG movies, right? And like, there's been very episodic, mostly narrative focused within the realm. They slot narratively into the existing timeline, but they don't disturb or upset the other parts around them too much. I mean, it's not until now that we're getting essentially a proper sequel to any of them, and even then, I suspect that story will be mostly singly told. So if you hadn't seen the previous one, it's not going to impact on your enjoyment. It's going to be understandable. So I think maybe that's their focus. They go, right, if a player hasn't picked up Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 Remake, they can still pick up 4 and relatively still follow the story, still understand stuff. And it doesn't matter if they don't know what this is or that is. It's explained in the game what it means to the character or what the narrative is, and you can just enjoy it for what it is. But I think that is a missed opportunity. You can have both. You don't have to have one or the other. You can have both of those things. And I think Capcom has been a bit shy. The modern Capcom has been a bit shy to do it.
Shy is a better word than lazy. Shy.
Yeah.
Starstone, what about you, my friend? Where do you feel the lore in Remake 4 is?
I'm not going to cover the ground that you guys have just already touched on, because it'd just be repeating what you've said. But I mostly agree for the most part. I think areas where I found it surprising was everybody thought, I think, the Remake 4 was going to put this big band-aid or plaster over the problems that the original Resident Evil 4 created. And obviously, as I've talked about before, Resident Evil 4 created an issue so bad that we've basically had to experience a near 17-year course correct through various corrections and revisions and Umbrella Chronicles and Resident Evil 5, and all these things have kind of tried to inform back to this game to make it more relevant. And I think a lot of people saw the remake as a really good opportunity to clarify exactly what happened with Umbrella and things like that. And outside of the areas that you guys have just talked about, in some ways the remake is more vague and it's baffling in some ways. So anyone, we all joke about stock prices crashing and, for all intents and purposes, Umbrella is finished. But that's ironically more than what the remake gives you. And it's kind of hilarious in that, the disposal of Umbrella is even less within the narrative of the numbered games now if you just play the remakes. Remake 3 ends with, Jill swearing she's going to take down human greed. And then Remake 4 comes along and we don't even address it in the intro, really. It's not like, the original version.
This is the irony to me of what I was moaning about before, is that if at the end of the day they have got this big idea of how they're driving the remakes towards we didn't get rid of Umbrella the same way we originally did because XYZ, it's going to be like, oh my god, this was their master plan all along.
Yeah, and I find that ironically humorous that it's even less cohesive in some ways. If you play the games in order, like the remakes in order, it's even more murkier now than it was originally, and that was the big thing that I think everybody expected this game to fix. With regard to what you guys have just said about being lazy with introducing elements that could tie within the greater series, I just think they're just pleasing the crowd in some ways. They're just introducing fan service, but it's all very surface. So, like, they give you a collective cheer because they've put Rita Phillips in Remake 2, but then introduce a narrative that actually kind of makes Outbreak not able to happen. They throw in Operation Javier and the community collectively goes, fucking hell, yes, from the trailer. And then the game reveals that Operation Javier is essentially completely different to what we know in the standard canon, in the prime timeline, or whatever it is we call it. So I'm really torn on the sort of fan service stuff, that it gets to the point where I almost wish they hadn't bothered, if they're kind of twisting what the original references mean now within the wider narrative. And I'll just finish this brief introduction by saying I recently re-listened to episode 31 of the podcast, which is our first reaction to Remake 2's announcement. And if anyone has a spare 2 hours, give it a listen, because it's fascinating. Because in it, we basically declare, Batman included and myself, that the remake timeline will have to exist entirely on its own. Like, there's no way that these games and whatever they do, whatever storyline additions they add, can weave and tie in with the main storyline. And I just find it interesting that there has clearly been a shift. Because I think even you, John, now are a bit warmer to introducing elements if they don't contradict or anything like that. It's just interesting to see how our mindset has changed, indeed, in 7 years.
Yeah, but I think in our defence back then, I don't think we anticipated how far this remake train was going to go. And if anything, since these remakes started 4 years ago, the concept of canon has become less and less important every single day.
I agree, yeah, unfortunately so. I think that is the hard reality of it.
Yeah. I don't know. It's a difficult one. I don't want to get bogged down in what's canon, what isn't. At the end of the day, I really enjoy the added lore they've introduced to this game. And one of the ways it is so successful is, Sean's talked about all the retcons that the remakes of Raccoon City have introduced there. You could take everything Remake 4 has introduced and basically lay it on top of the original game. And pretty much 95% of it would all work and fit fine.
Yeah.
And that's testament to how successful the lore is in this game, I think.
Yeah, it certainly, from my perspective, the two most successful remakes in terms of taking the original and bolting on bits in a respectful way are Remake 1 and 4.
Yeah, absolutely.
But there's a similarity with those two, because both are, from a geographical point of view, standalone. No other game really takes place... Well, no other game took place in the original mansion. No other game takes place in the village. So there was that geographic ability to expand, which I think helps.
And also, I think the fact that the Remake 1 was a remake of a camera angle driven game and it was done the same. And likewise, this is the first remake of an over the shoulder game. So in a sense, all you're doing in some areas is just making it look nicer. Remake 2 and 3 very much needed an entire overhaul to be relevant to people today, I think. And that's where the reimagining aspect of it comes into it more.
Yes, absolutely.
Ashley.
What's happening to me?
Ashley, is this the first time you've coughed on blood like this?
You want to start explaining?
The cough, the blood, is caused by something called Plaga. Okay. You saw those people, right? And you have the same thing inside you. The same thing that made them like that. This, what you're experiencing, these symptoms, they're only the beginning.
I don't want to become like them.
You are, well, lucky. You see, at this early stage, the parasite, the Plaga, it is possible to remove it with a surgical procedure. And all you need is some know-how. And oh yeah, the right equipment.
Wait, you two?
No worries. See, I have a plan. But you're going to have to trust me. Great, we're partners then.
Hey, why are you...
No time for any questions. The clock is ticking.
Why are you helping us?
Because it makes me feel better. Let's leave it at that. We'll contact you later.
Well, let's take a deeper look then into the specific lore, and we're going to start with my particular favourite area, which is the monsters, the BOWs, because there's been quite a lot of changes here. I would say for the better, and John touched upon it in his introduction, just talking about the superior species Plaga, and I think it's probably worth to start on that, and then we can kind of talk about some of the other BOWs that we fight in the game and how they've changed. So, John, you succinctly told that the superior species Plaga, a new version of the Plaga, there's been quite a few in the Prime timeline now after 4. But this one, as you said, doesn't take over the head of the host, or the brain of the host, meaning that they retain their intelligence and free will, which is that distinction that we don't, as you said, we don't get in the original, but it makes there to be 3 layers of superiority and infection almost. You've got, the people that are completely taken over, which is normal Plagas, then you've got people that are taken over but retain free will. And for some reason, they still want to continue on with their work, but there's a handy file, isn't there, in Remake 4 that kind of says why they still want to do the work. They've seen what the normal Plaga does, and, no one in their right mind would go, oh yeah, this is great. But you can see the effects of the dominant Plaga has on even the superior species Plaga. I think, the file talks about that complete submission, to free will. It's almost like they feel they're being released almost, even though they're being under complete control. Praise the holy insects and things like that. There's all sorts of, well, it's very cultist, isn't it, I suppose? But even infected with the superior one, they are under complete control of the dominant Plaga, and they feel that they're doing God's work, or, Sadler's work in this case. So that's quite a good explanation as to, why they continued their work, and then Sadler retains the dominant Plaga. We'll come to the Amber in a minute. But, John, is there anything else you wanted to add on to it as to why you feel, that this was a good addition to the lore? Or if anyone thinks it differently, do you think it actually murkies the water, in particular with what we know going forward with RE5?
I think it just makes the Plaga a much more effective bioweapon. It's like what I said in the intro. When you're infected with a subordinate Plaga, the host regresses and basically becomes so simple-minded that they're basically useless for any sort of complex task other than being like a docile workforce sort of thing. And when you look at that concept, it's like, well, how have they been able to study the parasite and perform, genetic manipulation experiments and create things like the U3 and the regenerators? How have they managed to do that if they're effectively not much better than zombies, in terms of intelligence? So the superior species Plaga now answers that question, because you retain all your faculties. If you're some leading scientist, you will retain all your knowledge and expertise, but you will still be at the mercy of Osmond Sadler if he commands it, because he's got the dominant Plaga. He can control them all. So it's the perfect weapon in that sense. And obviously this is the new Plaga that Ashley and Leon have been infected with. So Leon won't regress into a zombie-like state like he would in the original game. He'll retain his sense of self, but he'll be completely subservient to Sadler. Likewise, Ashley, when she gets sent back to the US and back to the White House, she'll be the same old Ashley. No one will suspect anything, but she's now subservient to Sadler. It just makes much more sense than the original did in that respect. And the files have done well explaining it here, saying all the researchers have been infected with it. There's a captive researcher who's like, oh yeah, we're all done for now. We're all going to get infected with this Plaga and become slaves. And that's exactly what happens. And that's what makes the Los Illuminati so powerful. And it gives more credence and more believability to their plan of world domination, rather than the original game, which was, yeah, we'll infect Ashley with a subordinate parasite and then send our one knackered battleship with 200 Ganado on it to invade the United States. It's much better in this version. And Sadler's dominant Plaga now being a one-off, makes it much, much more valuable. And then we've potentially got a 4th variant as well, depending whatever the Amber is, because that's hinted to be even greater. So, it's an improvement. It's better, I think.
How in the original, I struggle to remember, was there actually any explanation as to how the original BOWs were created, or was Lewis and his research team just kept alive as humans to do all this work, or were they always depicted as being infected as well? Do we know?
Well, there's no mention. This is one of the problems with the original game. There's absolutely nothing at all. There's no mention of any, Lewis aside, there's no mention of any research team, any scientists. Right. You get vague references to the various creatures being made via a combination of, genetic manipulation and what but they don't go into any great detail like they do with, like, T-virus BOWs. It was all left very, very vague. And even this game, it probably still doesn't go into as much detail as it should, but at least gives us answers. We get the fella who works for Salazar, I forget his name, Isidore or whatever he's called. He develops the U3 series, and it tells us how he does it. Yeah. And likewise, we get a couple of files on the creation of the regenerators as well. So It just makes sense now because it's clarified that, the Los Illuminados have got a team of researchers and they've been given this special parasite, so they retain all the faculties, they're still good to go, but now they're completely loyal to Sadler. It's just a massive, massive improvement.
I think that helps, but in terms of, there's a couple of offshoot points then we want to talk about, is the superior species Plaga. In the original, we know that Krauser and others had the dominant species Plaga, and that is what is captured by Ada and sends it to the rival organisation, whatever company she works for. And then Wesker sends his team down and extracts the dominant Plaga from the dead body of Krauser. So because of that, if my memory serves me well with RE5, they then use that data to then create the Type 2, Type 3, Type 4 Plaga we see in Kajuju.
Yes.
So that creates a bit of a sticking point, unless, I'm caveating this enormously, because we don't know what's going to happen in potentially separate ways if it comes along. They could, I suppose, potentially still take it from Sadler's body, maybe.
Yeah, that would be the obvious workaround. Wesker gets it from Sadler's corpse instead of Krauser. That's where the one plot hole of Remake 4 comes in, is why do Mendez, Salazar and Krauser mutate the way they did in the original? Because that's indicative of having a dominant Plaga, which we know they don't have. And one of the files specifically states about the superior species is there is nothing special about it. It doesn't have any special variability other than the host retains their mind. So why can they suddenly mutate so extremely? And that's something I hope separate ways will address. Unless it's got something to do with this black water. It's clear that they've potentially got this superior species parasite, and maybe ingestion of this black water will help them develop these abilities to mutate. I don't know, but I just hope it's something separate ways will address.
Because it's almost done on will, on command, isn't it? Certainly Krauser's has always been that way. He could, bring up his mutation as and when. Salazar doesn't go into the Queen Plaga like he does in the OG, which you could say, perhaps that's a reason for his mutation. Mendez, you could say, well, he had a barrel of explosive or petrol chucked at him, that's why he went the way he did. Because otherwise, as what the game is saying, is that potentially you could have had hundreds of Uber Plaga bosses, how many of their research teams could have all become these very special, very hard to kill boss fights, basically. As you said, the superior species is near identical, bar not going into the brain. Then why didn't, or how, what would have prevented them just going, and getting really angry because they've spilt some blood or something, and then they just suddenly mutate and they get this spike just coming out of them and causing a muck. Who knows? So yeah, you could be right. Perhaps they do need a little bit more meat on the bones, so to speak, as to what controlled the mutation, if anything.
Yeah, it's the one thing that Capcom seem to have overlooked. With this being a remake, whether they've just copied the boss fight template of the original game and not realised that the story changes they've now made suddenly make these aspects not make sense anymore. So I'm hoping they've not overlooked it, and as I say, I hope separate ways will address it in some capacity. Leon specifically asks Krauser if he's being controlled by the cult, and he says, no, I've got absolute free will.
This has always been an issue with Plaga for me. I've always found with the bosses, the mutation's always so weird, and, with a T-virus, you could, pick any animal that's infected with a T-virus, you'd have a good idea if it's going to become big, scarier, or what, there's quite a lot of consistency with the T-virus. The Plagas in 4 and 5, not only are they seemingly quite random, but they also seemingly react to the environment that they're around as well. So, I'm thinking of Ricardo Irving, just happens to mutate into an aquatic type creature, which is handy because he's on a lake. They're very video gamey, aren't they? Which is fine, but we've always tried to, as I said, dig that little bit deeper to try and work out why that would happen, and it's very hard with the Plagas. That's why I've always had a long-term issue with it, because there is very little consistency in what they do, and this is a problem that sadly has continued in the series ever since, all the way up to Village.
But in fairness, that aspect has always kind of been there, because there's a file in Umbrella Chronicles where Wesker theorises that does the host's mindset influence the mutation of the virus, because, if you read the Umbrella Chronicles novels, Sergei Vladimir is obsessed with, pain and suffering, and when he transforms, he literally gets ripped apart by thorns. Wesker writes that down in his journal and says, well, if that's the case, if he's obsessed with pain and he mutated like that, is that the virus doing that? And then he wonders, what will happen to him. And that's an interesting parallel with, as you say, with the Plaga.
Morpheus too.
Yeah, exactly.
Same sort of thing. Yeah. What about you, Sean? Where do you see the superior species Plaga?
Yeah, I don't have really much more to add. I mean, I think, again, you touched upon it, Nick, that I think if you sort of try and link it up with RE5, then it's going to cause some minor headaches. I don't think it's going to be quite as bad as like law breaking as such, but certainly within the context of the remake, and this is kind of what we were saying earlier, like this in terms of it, like the Remake 4 being a standalone entry, it does address quite a few issues that the original game presented.
Rob?
I mean, yeah, there isn't much. I mean, John's basically explained, and yourself have explained exactly what the issues are. I mean, yeah, it is a confusing situation with having characters that it's that classic. Yeah, it wasn't broke. Didn't need fixing because the way it made sense narratively and form made sense for the OG version, made sense for its version that it had. But now that it's that domino effect. You make a change here, you have to explain something else down the line, and sometimes those things just aren't going to line up. And I think this is just one of those things that they've tried to answer another question and fix a potential what they considered a bigger issue, and it's made a slightly smaller issue at least at this stand. But as you correctly said, maybe the DLC will address some of this and make bits of it more clear, or it won't, and it'll just be its own thing, or it'll make things more confusing. We won't know until it does. But I think it's a thing in a nutshell, really. You could apply this to a lot of the things in the game that they've changed. They've created these little loops, I guess.
It's worth caveating up just briefly that it is frustrating that we're being sort of arbitrarily made to wait for Separate Ways, because, like, ironically, Separate Ways in the original was announced before the GameCube release came out. It's what caused a lot of problems at the time with the sort of sales for the GameCube. A lot of people accused them of sabotaging their own sales because people knew a PS2 version was on the way with expanded story. And it just feels like we're in a Separate Ways waiting room at the minute, that we're sort of formulating an entire podcast around questions that may yet get answered months down the line, and that's going to be kind of frustrating because it's going to date this podcast. But this is the content we try to provide for you all, and it'll be a nice time capsule of an episode, if nothing else.
Well, they all are. We have a very hit and miss predictions history, but that's all part of the fun. We mentioned the black water as well, so this was a new thing they added, and I think a lot of criticism I certainly had of the original Resident Evil 4 was, why was there lava in northern Spain, and this castle seemingly sitting on, a liquid that will destroy bricks if left to just sit in a lava. This is not Bowser's castle, people. Lava does destroy things. So I was pleased that they got rid of the lava. I was pleased they got rid of a lot of the nonsense of, the back end of the water room or whatnot. But it was replaced with an interesting concept of this kind of black water, which was something I don't think any of us saw coming, really, but it's like a secretion that was used to help make the Novastara. The bugs. We'll call it the bugs. The Novastars. Do you think this is a good addition, or at the moment, again, are we still in the area of we're not sure yet?
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the one aspect that they didn't explain at all, really. I mean, it's clearly important. It seems to be secreted by the Plaga. When Salazar mutates, he spits gallons of the stuff out at Leon. They seem to be stockpiling it in the castle, because like you say, the Hall of Water is just full of pools of this black liquid now. It's clearly used to help with the gene manipulation experiments in creating the various creatures, and it's also used for ceremonial purposes because we see it given to Ashley. And like you said in one of our other conversations, Nick, I think it acts like the Cadu parasite. It just helps the assimilation of the parasite. It maybe speeds it up, makes it a bit more effective. But if you ingest this liquid without having a Plaga inside you, it has a negative effect and sort of drives you into a state of madness.
But we don't know what's in it, do we? I think this is the...
It comes from within the Plaga. They secrete it, and it obviously has something to do with how they take control over a host. And, that's why it's valuable. That's why they stockpile it at the castle. But yeah, we really do need a couple of files, hopefully in Separate Ways, to explain exactly what it does.
Could it be what courses through a human's veins when they're infected? Is that, like, actually what is going through, like, Leon and Ashley's arms?
Yeah, possibly, yeah. I think
they found a way to extract that.
Yeah, and it obviously helps the Plaga gain control over its host. But as we see from like the prisoners who get tossed down that pit in the castle, if you drink the liquid without having a Plaga inside you, it has a negative effect. It just drives you mad.
What's interesting, if it potentially is the stuff that runs through a human's veins, then the original did allude to that with Leon's hallucination in the cabin after the lake battle.
Yes.
Because he sees this black substance sort of rushing up his arms, doesn't he?
Yeah, he did. Another interesting aspect of this liquid is whether it gets transmitted into an unaffected person if you get bitten by a Plaga animal. Because we see in Lewis's grandfather gets bitten by what he describes as a wolf, which we think must be a colmelos, or however you pronounce it. And he is infected with this madness. And this happens 1981, I think, according to the family photograph. So that's 12 years before the Los Illuminados actually approach the village and infect them all. So where has this madness come from? And I think the village chief says in his journals as well that, this madness is spreading, and that's how the cult eventually tricks the village into accepting the Plaga, because they say this will cure you of your madness. So I'm wondering, if you get bitten by a colmelos or a Navistador or whatever, it transfers this black liquid into you, similar to how the T-virus would transmit, I suppose, and you gradually become mad to the point where Lewis's grandfather killed himself, or Mendez killed him by burning the cabin down.
That has some big implications. That suggests then that even at that point, if that's a secretion from the Plaga, that means a Plaga was wild in the 80s that wasn't fossilized or mummified or whatever it was before they dug it up.
Yeah, we're a little bit hazy on the timeline of when the Los Illuminados actually got hold of the Plaga, because if you go by the Salazar family chronology, it seems to be the early 90s when Ramon is still a young boy. He's a sickly boy. And his mother invites the cult in because they say they can cure him, and all the cult does is murder the 7th Castellan, his father, presumably murder his mother, and manipulate Ramon into undoing the seal of the Plaga. But as you said, this wolf, this infected wolf, whatever it is, seems to be, unless we're looking too much into it, maybe, I don't know, he just got bit by a wolf and was infected with gangrene or something, I don't know. It could do with being a bit better explained. Or maybe the Los Illuminados were in the castle for a good number of years, generating this black liquid and taking over the whole castle before they then came down to the village.
Because the uncovering of the Plaga hasn't changed too much, other than the kind of substances that it was fossilized in. They remained almost traditionally in big amber vaults, if you like. And that's where they excavated it, and we see the kind of minecart levels and all the excavation going on. But that hasn't changed significantly, if at all. I don't know. I mean, yeah, could we have just had someone doing their own paleontology and then got infected, and I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not sure, but again, they sort of clarified that aspect by adding more details, because in the original game, we don't know how the cult found the parasite in the first place. All we know is we get some vague notion that the first Castellan defeated them in battle and then sealed the parasites underneath his castle, and even that itself's ambiguous. It's like, well, how did he do that? Did he literally grab every single person that was infected and just chuck them in a pit underground and cover it in concrete, or what? But, the remake clarifies that it's actually the Los Illuminados who find the parasites at the site of the castle. Sometime in the 16th century, I can't remember what year it is exactly. And then that's how they build up their power base for like 100 years. And then the first Castellan comes along in the 1700s and defeats them in battle and then expels them to the island. And then the first Castellan takes over the castle where the parasites are to sort of keep guard over them to make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands again. So that again was honouring the story of the original game, but it added some clarifying details which makes it a little better.
In the original, there's always been a bit of confusion about the translation of this, hasn't there? But in the game, you can see that the Plagas were fossilized, and they were almost revived from fossilized. But I think in other things it said they were potentially mummified. But I don't think we ever saw that in the game. They brought back to life, because obviously a fossil is a rock. So
yeah, the Japanese says they were mummified, but the actual in-game graphics, you can clearly see they are fossilized in the rocks. So it's maybe a bit of both.
This has gone down the Jurassic Park route, really, isn't it?
Yeah,
of being able to get the things out of the amber.
But the fossilization in the original game never made much sense anyway, because the parasites were only ever under the castle for a couple of 100 years at most, and that's not enough for something to turn into a fossil. Whereas Remake clarifies, well, actually, no, the parasites were there all along, possibly hundreds of thousands, millions of years, in which case some of them, probably are fossils.
Mm.
So again, it's honouring the original story, but it's improving it, or expanding on it at least.
Yes.
Hey, got a smoke?
I do. The kind you like. Now where's the amber?
Fortunately, it's not on me at the moment. And you really should be telling me what a good job I did. Busted my ass and managed to hide it right before I got caught. Which is why I'm still alive.
The deal was, we get you out of here when you deliver the amber. No amber, no protection, Luis.
Such a stickler for details, Ida. Okay, then. I'll go get it now. How about that? And I do have something else I need to get, too.
So the other new area, or the other new part of the Plagas that I think is going to be important for certainly for Separate Ways, is the amber. Now, we see in the game, towards the end of the game, huge stockpiles of amber, and Lewis talks about it in some of the files. He says, there's loads of it, and he just happened to, I'm guessing, having a stroll, and then sees a particular amber that interested him because of the shape, I think, and he takes it back, and through his research, finds that there is a gene present in the Plagas that was in that particular amber that is the same gene that is present in Sadler's dominant Plaga. Lewis gets all excited about it, but before he can do anything about it, it's confiscated. Do you think, this is to everyone, do you think that they're going to use the amber, I'm not saying future games, but I mean, we already know that Wesker was after the amber from kind of ending cutscenes, but how important is it going to be going forward? And are we going to see it again in Separate Ways?
Well, it's possible that the amber is... I know it's hinted to be something greater than a dominant Plaga, but it might simply just be another dominant Plaga sample. And we know Ada ends up with it anyway, but if they want to continue smoothly into Resident Evil 5, as Resident Evil 5 is now, then they'd probably have to do what you suggested earlier. Wesker would have to get the dominant Plaga from Sadler's corpse. But in terms of what the amber actually is, I don't think they'll explain it in Separate Ways. We might get a couple of files giving us a few more hints as to what it maybe can do, but I don't think we'll get anything more than that.
You don't think it's just become the MacGuffin, and it's just going, right, rather than an actual Plagas, we're just going to use it? Because would that not still work if Wesker gets hold of an amber sample? Then by definition, he's kind of got the genes of the dominant Plaga, which is what he would then need to help create the Magini. We're going around in a roundabout, but to get to exactly the same destination.
But as far as we know, that one amber sample is completely unique, and obviously we know from the ending that Ada doesn't send it to him.
How unique, though? I mean, that's the thing with the game. Will they just go, we'll find another one?
Yeah, I don't think they'll go into it. If anything, they will have Wesker get the dominant Plaga genes he needs from Sadler's corpse. The amber, whatever it is, I don't think we'll ever find out what it is. I think Ada will just send it to the rival company executives, and that'll be the end of it. We probably won't hear about it again. They're going to have Wesker front and centre in Separate Ways. This is his big comeback, so I'm sure through dialogue between the two of them, we'll get some indication of potentially what it is and what it can do, but I don't think we'll actually ever see it in action.
I'm just thinking out loud now. We didn't see the Queen Plaga in Remake 4 like we did in the original. Do we think that the amber potentially could be a Queen Plaga, the dominant species, like the one below and then the normal one? That's the hierarchy of whatever the original Plaga is or was.
Yeah, it's very possible, and that would be a cool explanation, actually, because in the Los Illuminados Bible, or whatever you'd call it, I was very intrigued by that imagery when the cult member of that time, is it Adam Sadler, discovers the Plaga for the first time, and we see an image of what looks to be like a tree-like organism, which is obviously very similar to the Endipire drawings we see in Resident Evil 5. which is also supposed to be a Plaga queen. So I like that correlation, and that's quite a good theory you've got there of the amber potentially being one of these queens, which would obviously make it supremely valuable.
Such a fool, Mr. Kennedy. To have been bestowed with lore settlers.
You talk too much.
Failed. You vulgar, utterly uncivilized mongrel. Allow me to show you that which has been granted by my master, if I will look out. Stage is set for the final act.
So that's quite a cool little insight into, I suppose, the changes into the Plaga lore. Rob, particularly, what did you, in terms of the other BOWs, did you prefer the remake or the OG? I'm particularly talking about Salazar. I think there's a lot of body horror with Salazar's mutation in the original game. You kind of see that, you know, he's sucked in, isn't he? And then you kind of, he feels sorry for his bodyguard. He goes, oh, crap, off he goes. And then he just kind of like merges in and just kind of comes out into, you know, in this awful kind of beast thing. Whereas, whilst I think boss fight is much better in Remake 4, in terms of what happened, I think there's a little bit more to it in the OG.
I think that's also to do with the narrative stance, that the way that the dialogue plays out in the original. There's a lot of positioning him as such a small man that he's always above people. You know what I mean?
Mm.
So when he turns into that monster, he's inside it, but he's up towering above you again. I think it's just this design of a narrative concept to show the short man syndrome. So yeah, that body horror aspect is because you focus in the cutscene of a lot more dialogue in a cutscene of him inside the creature, whereas it doesn't really happen in the remake. He talks to you during the fight, and you kind of just you see him in glimpses of him fighting. It's not like the narrative cutscene. So I think that's what makes the impact of the OG slightly feel different, even though the design is obviously more mobile in the remake, but it's basically not that different in actual design concept. So I don't know, it's kind of a weird one. Don't think either is better than the other, they're just different.
Does any other comments on any of the BOWs? Can we talk about the regenerators? So we get a bit more information about the regenerators. Sorry, I think they've been changed.
I mean, one of the things the remake does all round is just improve all the backstory. I mean, this has got some delicious files in it. The files in this game annoy me because in some ways they contain the worst of like what Resident Evil 4 did, in that they were basically giving you a commentary on exactly what you're doing at that point. And then at best they're like RE1 style deep dives into, the biology of these creatures. And, like we've said before, like the pronunciation's going to be terrible, but the novice adores or whatever, they give you a great feeling of like the chimera of the original Resident Evil, in like how they're born within a womb and things like that. And it's all very grim and superb body horror if you're into that kind of thing. I think all round, the BOWs, if we're even calling them that, the backstories and the lore and everything attached to them are all infinitely enhanced with the remake for sure. With Salazar's fight, I'll put my hand up in the air and say I prefer the original because I really like the grounded nature of his location. I think it works well within the sort of hive that he becomes part of, and I really like the dynamic of that boss fight. The problem is with the original is that most people are armed to the teeth by that point, so the fight is over in very short time. I found his mutation in the remake nonsensical. What even is it? He kind of is like almost spider-like around, but it gives the impression that he's kind of flying, but he isn't, because he's got these weird like almost web shooters, Spider-Man style.
Is he not flying? I thought he was like a bat type creature.
No, he's got little web shooters that he launches out from various appendages that stick him to the walls. So he's not flying, he's actually walking around it like a spider. It's very weird. Next time you play it, Nick, give a good look and you can actually see he walks around the arena with his web shooter kind of. It's not web, it's just kind of like strange little stretchy appendages that stick to the walls.
There is a lot of like tendrils along the walls and stuff, so when he falls into that pit, there is possibly, well, Plaga Queen could be down there, we don't know. There's definitely something down there because there's these sort of sentient tentacles crawling up the walls.
So, yeah, I'll definitely have a better look at that. I say it's quite an intense battle.
It's a lot harder.
I'm just trying to get through it. I was down to
unless you use the egg.
Unless you use the egg trick, yes.
Because the egg trick is, they even give you a big clue, so I know it's intentional. It's not like an oversight on Capcom's part. It's totally meant to be in there. But and I suppose it's a nice skip if you're trying to do one of the harder challenges.
Absolutely. I said there's not a lot of added information with the regenerators. They just, I think the file just talks about how I've created new life. So a lot of it, I think, is down to the kind of visual impact and, that this separate Plagas. I do prefer the idea that the kind of Iron Maidens were still present, if you know what I mean. They kind of like mutated to become Iron Maidens, if you like.
They're almost like a V-act, aren't they?
Yeah.
I agree.
In a world where the whole game is bonkers in terms of its monsters, that was oddly more believable than quite a lot of it. It seemed as like, they are almost made up to be like, indestructible. So let's give them one last hurrah. And they did test you quite a lot. And yeah, I like that idea because I wasn't a big fan of the Iron Maidens in the first game. It just seemed a little bit, okay, you just want to make them a bit more tricky. But this flowed a bit better, I think. It doesn't really explain why they suddenly go all spiky on you, but
Where are we with thinking the general consensus that the second Verdugo, which is basically, as we know from a file, is now U3, will be a separate ways boss?
100%, yeah.
Yeah, they can't leave a Verdugo just not answered, just roaming around. Because the problem is their design is too iconic and too distinctive to just have one disappear from the narrative like it does in the remake.
I think we'll get a boss at the end of every, not chapter, but every kind of section in Ada. It's going to be like a very condensed version of the entire game. So I think there'll be one at the end. So the end of the castle will be regenerated, and Sadler at the island. I'm not quite sure who they'll pick for the village, whether they'll do a Mendez battle.
Maybe that's where the Super Chainsaw guy will turn up.
Yeah.
He's not actually in the game at the minute. The Mad Chainsaw demo actually has a piece of content that's not in the game at present.
And I think we'll probably see more of Mendez as like a Mr. X stalker type guy in separate ways, maybe, because they're all obsessed with chasing Ada in the original game.
You did mention about mutations, Nick, and I will say with bringing up Mendez, that I do find the mutation sequences on the whole very weak in the remake. Mendez's mutation in the original is a very like a John Carpenter-esque thing, massive mutation where he sprouts this huge spinal cord and claws come out of his hands and everything. Yes. And in the remake, he just kind of is engulfed in fire and he just emerges mutated. It's really disappointing. And Salazar's the same in many ways. You mentioned that in the original you get the sequence of him being engulfed.
But again, it's another recent trait with Village. We never see Lady D really change into her bat form.
And
Miranda the same, and Moreau mutates underwater. Heisenberg is behind. Yeah, it's like they don't want to animate him.
Especially when you think back to how amazing like the Birkin mutations were on PS1 hardware.
I think that's it, though. I think it's the technical requirements to have these things mutate in current generation design is a lot harder than what you could get away with in the PS1 era, where you're stretching polygons and adding limbs and stuff. It's probably a technical thing, so they try to creatively get around it as much as possible.
Oh God,
it's a complete model change.
Go back further, Jack.
Yeah.
Marguerite.
The thing is, in a movie, I would say that's a genius way to avoid having to do like extravagant special effects or whatever. But in a video game where technically anything is possible if you just apply hard work and money.
But I guess it's still the same thing. It still requires more artistry because you've got to work out what the stages are in between and how to animate between those stages. And it requires actual thought process. Okay, so we know what it's going to start at, and then we know what it's going to end up. So how does that limb get there, and how does that, and where does the giant eyeball come from, and where does the wings come out of? Like, I can get it because it's just like, it's a cheat. It is a cheat. It's totally a cheat, and it probably does save time, money, and budget, and design concepts, and because you'd still achieve the same goal. I want this thing to turn into that thing. How can I do it creatively by getting around it? Yeah.
Do you even see Sadler mutate into his spider form? I can't recall the cutscene, so I'm thinking it's not there.
Don't think you see much. I think you get implication. Now you're making me question that.
Whereas the original is very good because you get that close up of his face, and then it shoots out of like his body, and then the arms sprout out, and it's really, really clever how it's done. Actually, that OG4 cutscene.
Doesn't the camera just go to Leon and Ada go, and then
it does? Yeah, that's why I can't recall it. And then obviously with the final bit where you've got the final additional section, like he just emerges. I tell you what, it makes Simmons mutations look incredible, doesn't it?
It does.
Who'd have thought Resident Evil 6 would be a trendsetter?
It could be worse. We could have a Lucas fade to black.
I was going to say, you get Krauser's arm transformation, but then during the fight he ends up with the other arm, which just happens.
Yes.
Which is a good point. You talk about limitations though, Rob. It could be very much an RE Engine thing.
It's not just that, the limitation thing. I think it's a conscious design because it just requires a lot of extra effort in it's design, concept, animation, texture work, because it's merging one thing into another. If you cheat it and make it work, and I say cheat like it's a bad thing, but it's a creative decision to get around it. So
even old Jack Norman did it as well, didn't he? They just have him explode against a Velcro flag with a shower of blood, and then he's a tyrant.
We're not going to unsee it now, are we?
Just going to caveat and go back. I'm watching it. Sadler has the giant arms pop out his back.
Yes.
And then there's implication that there's more of that happening. And then it cuts away to Leon and Ada, and then you see some more arms popping out, and then it pulls back from his face with the eyeball, and then he's completely transformed. So they've avoided all the main bit. You just see the arms and then the eyeball, so that you don't see anything else. So yeah. It's creative. Watching it, it has the impact, but you definitely don't see his robe disintegrate and his falling apart and his bits coming out of everywhere and his face changing into yes.
I mean, let me just say, to anyone listening, Capcom are absolute masters of their craft now. They've got all the mocap studio down and everything, their cutscene creation and everything is industry leading at the minute. They're only really falling behind, the work that kind of Naughty Dog are doing now. They really are up there, I think, Capcom, in terms of what they're doing and, in production value, and these look expensive. So any nitpicks that we're leveling at the games, they are literally on a very base level. We're not, tearing these projects apart.
I don't even class as a nitpick. I'm impressed by that personally.
Yeah.
Because mentally, it's taken us to actually sit here and think about this before we go, did it do this? It's that whole trick of, did I think I saw it or did it happen? And you don't even take it in the moment. It just happens and you accept it. So that's not a bad thing. I mean, when I say that to essentially cheat a transformation, it's not at its detriment. It still has the same impact. It's just different, and that you realize, oh gosh, it's not until you actually start picking apart. And the only reason we even brought this up is that we have the OG version as a base for comparison. If this is an original game and that's how they did the transformation, we probably wouldn't even think about it. We would just go, oh, they transformed. Because the game narratively is cut around the transformation.
All good horror films, you fill in the blanks, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Or they show you enough that you make it feel worse. I mean, it's very... Movies that actually show you full transformations are rare. You're talking about your, American Werewolves in London and The Thing and so forth. A lot of movies. And these days, the CG takes over, it becomes too much of a CG transformation. People kind of balk at it because they go, oh, it doesn't look right, it looks a bit weird. So I think it's always a good cheat, even in movies, if you can imply and show as little as possible. It sometimes has bigger effect. So yeah, even in this day and age.
You have come, my child.
What do you want?
I simply wish to share this gift with as many as possible. A humble wish, don't you think? You see, we are all connected through the holy body. And now your flesh and bones, your very thoughts, are already one with us.
Bullshit.
Why do you reject serenity when you need only accept the sacred gift? Like she did.
Sadler!
Yes, the time has come. All these lambs join our covenant.
A good segue into some of the characters. I want to talk about Sadler first, and the revelation that Adam Sadler is now part of the RE canon. But there we go now. Only joking. But I think everyone...
Don't encourage them, Nick, please.
I know. Everyone must have read Adam Sadler at at first. But what? But
Black water sucks. It really, really sucks. Black water sucks.
I'm very disappointed that the actor who played Sadler didn't model it on Adam Sandler's Little Nicky character.
Oh my god. The thing is, the backstory of Sadler was very, very much welcome. I know we spoke in our review podcast how he perhaps doesn't have the campy, over-the-top personality anymore, and in his appearance wise is pretty much just a glorified Ganado in a hood, but his actual storyline was a lot more palatable, and a lot and learning about the Sadler's history, and more importantly the kind of history of Los Illuminados, really helped flesh out what he was trying to do and lead the group. And I think a lot of the environments helped with that as well. The end bit on the island, I think it was almost described as like the old island, wasn't it? Or the old village or something like that. We had the church and all that bit. That was all quite new, and it flowed very well, I thought, as a kind of end game. A bit like okay, this is the heart of Los Illuminados. And obviously the Sadlers, obviously an architect of that. And I wasn't personally expecting to get anything on Sadler, really, but it turned out quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were all just relieved, weren't we? Because the big prediction from a lot of the fandom was he was going to be connected to Umbrella somehow. And obviously we know in the final game they went a different way with the Umbrella connection, but I think it is better that he's not connected to the wider lore, for sure.
It's just like, I'm guessing the whole area was just, it almost mimics the Salazars. I'm not sure if they were going for that, but that was obviously the implication that on the island you had the Sadlers, and then on the mainland you had the Salazars, or potentially at different times. But this long history of these two families dominating this particular region of Spain. And then, if you find all the dead people, all their graves, and you've got to try and remember the numbers and all that sorts. But what did you think that history added to the lore?
Yeah, I thought it was good for the most part. It gives some context into why the cult is based at the island, for one thing. We know now they were banished there in the 18th century by the first Castellan. They've spent the last 200 years sort of building it up with aspirations of retaking that castle, because they know that's where the Plaga source is. So, it was nice to read these epitaphs from various leaders of the cult in centuries gone by. I think the only disappointing thing was we got nothing from actually Osmond Sadler himself. No personal journals or anything about his own, motivation and personal history with the cult. That was the only thing I think that was lacking, really. But yeah, it was definitely welcome for sure, because it was getting to the end of the game and I thought, well, we're just not going to get anything here. But then these grave sites kept popping up, and yeah, it was good what they did. But again, hopefully Separate Ways can elaborate on Osmond Sadler a little bit more.
I like that manipulation side of things. It wasn't really touched on in the original too much. And, you're presented in the original with Salazar being the Castellan, the king, if you like. You can even get his crown. And then it is somewhat odd. You've then got some old dude who's in charge, even though you've just kind of killed, the king that has merged with the queen, Plaga. Yet that's the person that's in charge. Remake 4, I think, with the help of the Plaga, explains what's happened. And the kind of history of the Salazars is quite helpful here, with the fact that Ramon was actually close to death. As you said, they came in and saved him somehow. Gave him the Plaga, so I'm guessing. And helped in that way. So I think that's quite a good addition as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of added a sympathetic touch to all three of the sub-villains, really. Mendez, we get a nice thing now that he was clearly a good man, took over the village from his father, I think, learned to read and write for himself so he could look after the village affairs. He taught maths to the children. He brokered deals with outside parties for fish and oil. So he was a just man with the best intentions of the villagers at heart, and he was manipulated by the cult just like everyone else was. So there's sympathy for him in that respect. And likewise with Krauser, he's so embittered with what happened in Operation Javier now with the loss of his men that he just wants, ultimate power to take revenge. He's not evil per se. He's not got aspirations of Umbrella taking over the world and restoring order and balance and whatever it is he says in the original game. And in his death scene, he sort of reverts back to how he used to be and makes amends with Leon in a small way. So I think that sort of sympathetic angle attached to all three of them added to their character depth a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think with Krauser, we as I said in the review, he just kind of comes out of nowhere in the original game. He's basically introduced as being, this is your next boss fight. Okay, right. And then, you're supposed to believe that, it's been a long time. You go, okay, is it? Fine. And again, we get course correction with Darkside Chronicles as well, which helps. And you're right in that everyone, I think when we all heard Operation Javier got a name drop, like, yeah, that's great. Let's not beat around the bush. Operation Javier in this is nothing like or to do with Operation Javier from Darkside Chronicles. So that's a huge retcon or a change. And I don't actually think that they can fit at all together. I think that is 100% retcon. I think it's very hard to headcanon them to be the same event, hard as you may try.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could if you really wanted to. I actually reviewed a couple of the original files from Darkside Chronicles in relation to Operation Javier, and the written orders file specifically states that the government will not get involved. If you get captured or compromised by the enemy, then the government will leave you for dead. And then there's another file, even though Operation Javier is just about Leon and Krauser going in, another file specifically states that the powerful people of Mixcoatl Village and the United States government and the local government of Amparo have all formed a coalition to expel Javier and have been amassing military strength, therefore implying that it's a much bigger operation than just Leon and Krauser alone. So if you really wanted to, you could just say, well, Leon and Krauser have got their mission, but then there is other special forces teams in the area eradicating other drug cartels. There's ways around it. I think rather than retconning it completely, I think they've just left it purposefully ambiguous. They've basically just added a few little details to explain why Krauser might be so pissed off, but they've purposely avoided mentioning anything else so people can just interpret it as they wish.
We are just getting started, rookie.
Are you being controlled by that cult?
This has nothing to do with them. I'm a free man who made a choice. Too slow. Haven't you learned anything these last 2 years?
A soldier like you! Why would you work for these freaks?
Why? You've forgotten what happened 2 years ago.
Operation Javier?
Do they, I can't remember, do they talk in Remake 4 that Operation Javier was a mission about BOWs, or I thought it was quite drug-focused?
Well, yeah, all you get is that case report file where it says it's a mission to eradicate the drug cartels of South America and that they've been planning it for several years, and I'm assuming it's called Operation Javier because Javier Hidalgo was the main man in that network of drug cartels in that area. It doesn't mention BOWs or anything like that, but then it was fairly recent intelligence in Darkside Chronicles that the US government were tracking an ex-Umbrella or one of the very last remaining Umbrella researchers who then got in contact with Javier, and that's what led to Leon and Krauser going in. So even though the game doesn't mention any of the specifics, I think it can be integrated into it if you really want it to. It's just a question of saying, yeah, there was other teams of soldiers in the area that were presumably under Krauser's command, and they all got wiped out. And Leon and Manuela and Krauser were the only ones extracted, presumably because they had Manuela, who had the T. Veronica virus in her blood. If it wasn't for that, maybe they would have been left for dead. Who knows?
So you have to headcanon that there's additional parts of it, plus you'd have to headcanon that you never hear Krauser mentioning the other groups or communicating with them.
Well, yeah, but this is the problem, isn't it, with remakes and stuff like this, because also in Darkside Chronicles, Leon says it's my first mission with Krauser, implying that they've only just met, so to speak, and obviously that's been retconned now because we know Krauser's been training Leon for several years, so it's one of these changes that, I didn't particularly like because it causes problems and at the same time it doesn't benefit the story they're trying to tell. I don't really understand why they just didn't stick with the original plot of Krauser being pissed off because he felt undermined by Leon, that sort of thing. But hey-ho. It is what it is.
It's Brandon Bailey all over again, isn't it, Sean? It's a name drop that actually, when you think about it, wait a minute.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I don't doubt Brandon Bailey's responsible for the entire story of the remake series going forward.
Yeah, it doesn't quite work. I mean, I'm very happy about an Operation Javier mention, but as I said, when they change things like that.
I think they're going to leave it, as with everything with the remakes, intentionally vague. And these people who are very hopeful that we're going to get Javier DLC, I think are going to be bitterly disappointed. It's absolutely not going to be. It's not going to happen. They're going to probably chuck out separate ways. They're going to do the follow-up Mercs DLC to make Ada and Wesker available, and then be done with it, I think. And then. Yeah. Please, with all my fingers crossed, RE9 next. Come on. But no, I mean, the Javier stuff is... I find Krauser in this game maddening, because he is probably the most... How to say it, with everything that John has said, he's the biggest problem we have with regards to making RE4 relevant with regards to the wider canon, because he has received the most changes. And with Javier being so different, but then again, it's not necessarily a problem, because it's not like everybody's playing Darkside Chronicles week in, week out, are they? You know, it's not even available on a current hardware unless you subscribe to, bizarrely, like the PlayStation Network's top subscription, and even then it's only a streaming game. What I'm basically saying is, like, Darkside Chronicles is the only place to play Operation Javier, but it's not like people are doing that on a regular basis. We're not seeing people enter the community saying, hey, I've found Resident Evil through this great game, Darkside Chronicles, so it goes back to that question of, does it really matter? And it probably doesn't. It only matters to us.
I'm not sure anyone's found Resident Evil because of Darkside Chronicles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Let alone someone going, I'll play Remake 4. It's just a little bit frustrating, isn't it? It's like you give these kind of little tidbits and you go, oh, yeah, that's good, but it doesn't always work out the way you would want.
Patch me through. I've obtained the amber.
Excellent.
Just one question. What are you planning to do with this?
We do not pay you
to ask questions. All you need to know is a new dawn is breaking.
100 will give their lives so that just one may live. I am expediting that change.
So, we're talking millions of casualties.
Billions.
Let's talk Ada Wesker, and I think we'll try and not do too much on these two, just because we are expecting quite a lot more information going forward. But Wesker adopts a similar role, but I suppose what we don't know too much is his position within the rival company. So at this point in time, he was, in the original storyline, he was, involved with, this is the rival company's main game, and he was going around trying to bolster his position internally within the company, which is why Ada was sent in as well. And that bit can be quite lost in the game. Ada's basically asked to spy on Wesker by other head people within the rival company, of which Wesker is also one. So it's like, one boss telling the other, watching the other boss. We don't know the dynamics at this point too much. And I'm going to need reminding, actually, about the end as to Ada's loyalties. She doesn't appear to have been sent in by another member of the organisation, I don't think.
Well, basically what happens is they both work for the rival company, so they've both got the same employers. Wesker, since Raccoon City, has built up his power base to the point where he's basically becoming too influential, and the other rulers of the rival company are becoming very nervous about how much his power is growing. So they turn to Ada and say, look, we want you to spy on him for us, report his movements back to us, and this is your loyalty test. You either pick us or you pick Wesker. And Ada, at that point, she doesn't give a shit about the rival company. She doesn't give a shit about Wesker, but she needs them both to help her get towards this mysterious ultimate objective that she has, which we never find out what it is. So she's faced with a choice, and at that particular time, it benefits her to send the Plaga to the rival company executives rather than Wesker. Why it does that, we never find out, but that's it in a nutshell. Ada doesn't work for a completely separate organisation, even though the dialogue might suggest that they both actually work for the same company. It's just that company is in the middle of a civil war, so to speak.
In the remake?
Well, in the remake, we still don't know. And like I said, this is Wesker's big comeback, so I expect him to be much more present in this new iteration of Separate Ways. I think he'll be on the radio to her all the time, and we'll hopefully find out a lot more of what's going on in the background. But from what little we've seen in this game, I do think it benefits that some of the Separate Ways cutscenes have been integrated into the main campaign, and likewise the Assignment Ada ending has been bolted onto this. I think that helps it greatly, because in the original, if you weren't bothered about side games and never played Assignment Ada, you wouldn't even know Wesker was in this.
Yeah, that's a fine point, yeah.
And likewise, we didn't really know who Ada worked for. We didn't really care, did we? We were more just bothered about, well, how she survived. We weren't really given any background on her as to what she was doing until later materials came out. So I do think it helps that we get some of these scenes in the main game now.
It does amuse me as well, and that's another area where the remake does falter a little bit. It's like the big moment between her and Leon. Everybody was expecting the remake to sort of patch over the fact that Leon already knew she was alive in the original game, and we're hoping we're going to get that sort of dramatic tension between the two characters. And then the remake is arguably less impactful than even the original game at this point. It's humorous.
Wesker's dialogue at the end seems to imply that they've accelerated the Ouroboros storyline because they have seemingly jettisoned the Umbrella revival plot.
Yeah.
As we all know, in the original game, he wanted the Plaga sample because it would help him re-establish Umbrella, and that's nowhere to be found in this. And I was half anticipating that because, as we know in the original lore, his Umbrella revival plot goes absolutely nowhere anyway, because his intentions change after he meets Spencer in Lost in Nightmares. And obviously we get Umbrella revived completely separately with Resident Evil 7, so I can understand why they've dropped that. But bringing the Ouroboros plan forward a couple of years does have its own issues with continuity. But again, Separate Ways will hopefully answer our queries.
If people follow me on Twitter, they'll know I've been collating information about how people feel about the originals and the remakes for a future podcast that we're looking to do later. And Ada's been a very interesting subject because, without treading into too tepid waters, despite the issues that people have had with regards to Ada, I've seen a lot of people respond that they actually like the fact that the remake allows you to see Ada's dilemma on screen for the first time. Like in the Separate Ways version of the continuity, when she portrays Wesker, she's very much aware that she's going to do it anyway because she's never really on Wesker's team. Whereas the ending of the sort of post-credit scene of Remake 4, you actually see her make this decision in real time. Like she's totally on board with Wesker until she has that conversation, and then she says like the how ambitious thing, and then she makes that decision to betray her. And in many ways, it is possibly the most interesting Ada's been on screen in a while for a Capcom that clearly is struggling to know what to do with her. It's almost like they finally took the promise of the RE6 ending for that character and actually ran with it for once by actually seeing her make a decision to do with her own fate that's going to, have implications for her going forward. It's interesting.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
But you actually do see a conflict, an emotional conflict with her in that scene. And it's very superfluous. She makes that decision in half a second before she's putting the gun to the helicopter pilot's head. But the point is we still see, when she starts that radio call with Wesker, she's very much on board with him versus how she is at the end of that conversation. So hopefully Separate Ways will really push that.
Just makes the original RE2 Ada so better, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Oh, it's so good. I'm just thinking about, we've been, as you said, so starved of, not of Ada, we've had quite a lot of Ada over the years, but not a lot of character development.
She has been
bizarre.
The character that suffered the most, because I think what frustrates about Ada is she's the character that has possibly had the most potential in terms of not only like character work but visual. You can do something different with Ada every time because she's that kind of character that you can literally reinvent her appearance with every single entry because it's fitting in with what the story is doing. She is dynamic in terms of she can essentially play a different character each time and it has to work within that narrative. She's the James Bond sort of character in many ways. And you've seen a Capcom sort of clumsily fumble their way through what to do with her. And their answer has been, don't answer anything, make her as mysterious as possible, and hope that no one notices for like over 25 years. And it's just, at this point, with the remakes retelling her character again and still not having any real answers is just frustrating as hell. It just doesn't work this time round. So actually doing what they did in the ending, I actually appreciate it a little bit, because you're seeing a change of character within her.
It just makes her arc in RE2, what a great foundation for her. You know, love it. Anyway, I digress. We should not focus on 1998 games. No, we must move ahead with the time.
Oh, what the fuck? Hey, stop it. Hey, Yankee. Got your name?
Leon.
Quiet type, eh? I'm Luis Serra. Guess you, me, picked the wrongest spot to vacation, eh? Hey, stop it. You move, I move. And I'm beat up enough as it is. I can see you're thinking. Bet you've been in spots like this before, huh? I guess you're here looking for someone. One more guess. Maybe some missing señorita?
Lewis, then. So, one of our final characters I think we want to talk about. Lewis was in desperate need of something, wasn't he, from the original? And adding to his backstory was one of the best things I think Remake 4 did. Really good performance all round. And someone that, if you don't know anything about Lewis going into the game, he kind of treads that fine line between, I suppose he kind of plays the Barry role a bit from the original game. He's helpful, but then he's kind of like not that helpful. And then he's like, oh, you used to work for Umbrella. He's like, yeah, but I'm one of the good guys, kind of. But, and you don't trust him at all. But because it's a remake, we know, where he's going, what he's doing, his demise, so to speak. So I think as a new player, I think if someone never played it before, and the first RE game they ever played was Remake 4, I think they'd have a lot of fun with Lewis. I think he actually has a really good arc in this. And I think you mentioned it in the last podcast, John, about having those ties to the village with his grandfather, and then having the ties to the research and Los Illuminados. I mean, you're stretching it a little bit with, he also works on the Nemesis program. Fine. But at least there is a bit of meat behind his appearance, rather than he's just that random cop from Madrid that's also a scientist. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't get much in the original. I think there was a reference to his grandfather in the original game, how they used to go hunting, which explains why he knew his way around the tunnels and things, but other than that, we didn't get anything. So to get a nice, more fleshed out backstory, and again, sort of a sympathetic one because his mum died in childbirth and whatever, was good. It was an improvement. He really was an excellent character in this, rather than the sort of Jack Sparrow comedic character from the original, who, like you say, just turned up completely randomly. And yeah, when I found out he was an ex-Umbrella researcher, I did kind of roll my eyes, but then it wasn't too on the nose. The connection was quite good. It wasn't overpowering. It was quite sensible what they did. I still see people now saying, oh yeah, Lewis created the Nemesis. He didn't create the Nemesis. Umbrella Europe had a working Nemesis parasite in 1988 when Lewis was 12 years old. Lewis joined Umbrella after he graduated university in the mid-90s, so he would have worked at the European Sixth Lab. He would have worked on the Nemesis parasite, sure, but he then left Umbrella quite a bit before the Raccoon City incident happened, and the actual Nemesis itself wasn't developed until after the Mansion incident, when they implanted the parasite into a tyrant. So he doesn't really have any ties to the Nemesis itself. It's more he worked with the best of Umbrella on parasites and learning about their control mechanisms and how it would make them more effective in the creation of bioweapons. And all he's done is take that knowledge and expertise and apply it to the Plaga research for the Los Illuminados, which has obviously added to the guilt he feels. So it's not the Nemesis that's based on the Plaga, it's sort of kind of the other way around.
You just got to stretch it and go, oh, he's done all this parasite work, he's a very good parasite bioengineer, and he's just happened to go home. And lo and behold, there's also a parasitic BOW that just happens to be dug up by the nearby castle.
Yeah.
That's the kind of... okay, fine. Rob, did you like the additions for Lewis?
Yeah, I did. I really thought that fleshing out his character, and even just, keeping him involved in more of the narrative was one of the improvements over the original that I really gelled with. And I wasn't sure if I would like his character more or less than I did the original, but I think it is another one of those improvements that the game has managed to make. So yeah, I was quite happy with that, and I liked having like motivational history, you know, like the stuff with his grandfather and all that sort of stuff. It adds depth to the character and makes you understand a lot more, and then like ensuring that you understood the connection with Umbrella, you know, and all that sort of stuff. I thought it was deftly handled as one of the things I really did enjoy.
And I think that's true of a lot of the remakes. I mean, you can level a lot of criticism against the remakes for various reasons, but in terms of the development of smaller characters, the remakes have done an excellent job. I'm thinking, you know, even today, Marvin's performance in Remake 2, superb. Carlos in Remake 3, brilliant. Tyrrell, wonderful, adding to that, and I think Remake 4 continues that with the characters. Yeah, we don't get a lot of Sadler, but at least we got a little bit in the files. But in terms of actual, you know, people going along, you know, as you see them in human form, yeah, Lewis gets a much needed improvement in that, and you know, helps deliver a believable storyline. And you feel it, don't you? He battles with you side by side, and then he's like just about to help, and then that moment where he just gets the knife chucked in him, you're like, oh. And you know it's coming. I prefer, as I said, I think we discussed it last time. I think I preferred his death in this. You know, just at that point, you're like, yeah, come on, Lewis, we can do this. And then the game just goes, no, that's it, he's gone. And then it's Krauser that's done it. And I thought, yeah, okay, that's made it personable. You know, there's only a certain amount they can go without you playing it in terms of Leon's history with Krauser. You know, they could spend hours talking about it in the game, but from a player's point of view, you perhaps need that little bit of in-game moment to help solidify, oh, this is becoming a little bit personal. And the killing of Lewis in front of you, just as you as the gamer of going, yeah, okay, he's on our side, he's going to help us, and then he's just taken away. I think that was probably one of their best decisions in Remake 4.
I think as well, having Krauser involved with Lewis's death actually gives Krauser more gravitas within the narrative as well, because he was very much a non-entity until a point in the original game. And I think having him integrated far earlier and having the sequence, you know, with the knife fight, Lewis's death and everything occur in the castle sequence only lends itself better to the narrative, for sure. I do find it's a bit of a stretch, though, that Lewis's key literally becomes this game's, as you mentioned earlier, lore room. That's about as late as it could occur within the game before they drop all these bombshell revelations for his character.
You kind of get like one early lore room, but it's kind of hidden, which is the attic, and then you kind of get that, and then you get the late lore room too. Yeah,
I mean, we don't get the conversation with Lewis and Leon with the chains, and I do feel that is a loss to the remake, where Leon talks about his first day on the Force and Lewis. Is he bullshitting now with the remake lore that he was a cop from Madrid? It would have been interesting to see that dynamic if, you know, they got more chance to talk about, you know, Lewis's. I know Hunnigan. She obviously drops the bombshell to Leon early on that Lewis is ex-Umbrella, but they don't. I feel that even with Lewis's expanded role, they don't get a chance to crunch that as much as I think we would have liked. It's still very briefly dealt with in their excursion, whereas it would have been probably better to have a moment in the original, like where they're chained together and they have to converse because they can't get out yet. It would have been nice to see maybe the chain sequence where they're chained up reworked after Leon had known about Lewis working for Umbrella, and then it might have actually provoked a greater discussion between the two characters. You know, how Leon feels so wronged by his awful day in Raccoon basically being at the hands of this guy that used to work for them. We don't really get that, and I think the game promises it, and it's still. This is the problem with the remakes in the whole. It's like we talked about the Easter eggs, didn't we? Like the game is happy to throw these tantalizing things at you, but then when it comes to actually delivering them, it sometimes leaves you a bit wanted, I feel.
An interesting point, though, because you could have actually had, as you said, an interesting discussion between Leon and Lewis about his role in Umbrella as basically as a job. It's not something that really comes up with when you have these big evil corporations. You've just seen it in Star Wars with kind of Andor, or the kind of mundaneness, or, you know, of working in the ISB or something like that, or, you know, just behind the scenes, of people just going about their normal lives doing a job.
And not realising they're evil.
Yeah.
To them, they're just turning up for work at 8 o'clock in the morning, doing a few things and going home.
Yeah, well, you could have had a really interesting story going, I've always been good at science. Umbrella recruited me when I was young, and it was so exciting. I got, moved to Paris, and I was, state-of-the-art technology. You could almost hear an excitement growing, and Leon's going, what the hell are you talking about? But at that point in his life, that could have been a really interesting conversation, and that would have actually then fed on quite nicely to where he is in the game, where he's deeply regretting what he's doing and what he's done, because he obviously willingly goes back, to his home, willingly joins Los Illuminados, eager to carry on with his, genetic manipulation, which he thinks was a good thing at that point. And that's not necessarily a wrong opinion to have. It's only when it was used in a negative way that he starts going, oh, crap, what have I done? It's the nuclear bomb thing, isn't it? That could have been a really good point. No, you're right. We could have had a detailed conversation with where Leon can only look at it from the end game of, well, create the T-virus, or, you've created monsters, but he's going, from here. And again, in Remake 4, you get the impression that I'm not sure how much Lewis knew about all the other creatures was going on. He had his own little part. He was almost like the super team on the old village area. I got the impression he was always doing the kind of microbiology, and other people were making the El Gigantes and the other weird things. And I wonder how privy he was to all of that, and whether he was just focused on Plaga. I don't know. That could just be a bit of hopeful thinking, but I don't know if anyone had any comments on that.
Oh, I think he was fully aware, because
okay.
In the Regenerator file, when the researcher's talking about creating it, he makes an offhanded reference to that pretentious colleague of his, which I think he takes to mean Lewis. I could be wrong, of course, but that's what jumped out to me when I first read it. This pretentious colleague of mine that's objecting to the Regenerator then says it's really dangerous, but I'll just ignore him anyway. So I think he was fully involved. I would say he was probably the chief researcher of the whole project. And it was only really when he saw how far it had developed, when he started to realise that, Jesus Christ, I'm creating a bit of a doomsday weapon here. And he wanted to change sides.
Well, good chance that we're going to get a lot more Lewis in separate ways. You never know, we could get an Ada and Lewis team up, like Lewis did with Ada Leon. That could be quite exciting.
But what's interesting about him, he's obviously had the amber on him all along. I know he meets Ada after the cabin siege and says he'll go and get it, like the original game. But then he gets it, but he still doesn't leave with her. He stays behind to make sure Leon and Ashley get cured first, and that ultimately leads to his death. So, that's another aspect to his character, which, shows that he's really trying to seek redemption for what he's done. He wants to help Leon and Ashley get out of there before escaping himself.
It's interesting if Separate Ways will elaborate on all that, because he continually, in the main campaign, doesn't turn up where he says he's going to be. He seems to be endlessly delayed, doesn't he?
Yeah, because he says he'll meet them in the courtyard and then the ballroom, and you get there and, he's not there at all, is he?
Ada, what the hell are you doing?
Nothing personal, Leon. Luis and I had an arrangement. Don't worry, I'll take good care of it. Ride's here. You coming?
I think we both know this is where we go our separate ways.
I mean, that moves us quite nicely on, and we've touched upon it already. What can we expect from Separate Ways? I think our list is quite long now, isn't it, chaps? Well, there's a question for what we can expect versus what can we hope for. I think our hopeful list is going to be quite high.
I personally can't wait for Sadler's battleship level, because that was truly the highlight of Separate Ways.
I think they'll scrap it. I won't be surprised
They
if it's gone.
absolutely will scrap it.
It'll go. As John said earlier, that's not the plan anymore, is it?
No, but like I keep saying, I'm hoping there'll just be much more Wesker in there. Because these remakes have bypassed Code Veronica, I'm wondering if they will, the conversations he has with Ada will sort of delve into his background and what's been going on with him since the mansion incident. I mean, oh Christ, I wonder if they'll mention Code Veronica, but change details of that like they did with Operation Javier. I don't know.
I think that's a risky endeavour in case they decide to actually make a Code Veronica remake down the track.
Yeah.
So that I think they'll avoid it.
Yeah, probably. But I think it's last chance saloon for any rival company information. If we don't get it in this, we never will. The original Separate Ways was so bare bones. Apart from Ada's report, there was no files. It was all recycled levels. So I really do think they'll make it much more involved this time. Interestingly, a lot of the original files from Resident Evil 4 were not carried over into this one. I think one of Lewis's notes was, one of the notes on the Parasites file was carried over, but none of the others were really in this, so I'm wondering if they might be included in separate ways, because a lot of them were exposition files anyway about how, what the cult members were doing to catch Leon and Lewis and that sort of thing. And I think Lewis will be much more involved, and hopefully Krauser too. It'll definitively answer whether they're working together or not, but even if they're not, I'm sure Krauser and Ada will have some sort of run-in. And hopefully we'll get some original levels as well. It won't just all be recycled stuff. It'll be nice if we see some areas of the village and the castle we haven't seen before. I know we've seen the sky tram lift thing in the background.
Mm.
And when we get to the island, Ada just disappears and doesn't show up again at all until right at the end. So, there's plenty of scope, really, for what they can do.
The island's where they'll do the only original piece of content, which is surely the battleship.
I was going to say, there's the area that you go through on the way down to the jet ski, which is like catacombs with like buildings inside, and there's always a possibility they could do something set in there where that's where Ada ends up on the island at first until she turns up and basically approaches the island from a different direction from where she separates from Leon. That's perhaps maybe an idea.
Is there anything on the collector's edition map that hasn't been covered?
No, it's all in there.
All in there, isn't
No,
it?
so it's all just the location. It's pretty vague in that regard. It's just a topographical
Separate Ways
map.
is interesting because there's something they'll probably have to address as well, which is the giant pharmaceutical company S, which we obviously think was reworked into Seashell, which then became Tricell, and this is their grand moment to fix that.
Well,
and
they
if
will.
They don't, I think it'll be odd.
We've already
Will
seen
it just become Tricell?
Yeah.
We've already seen the picture of Excella on Wesker's monitor, haven't we? So I'm sure they'll fix it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Yes.
I'm not taking those images as confirmation of Remake 5 either. I think that's just a neat Easter egg at the moment.
I don't think they'll mention Tricell at all.
You don't think they will? Even Infinite Darkness felt a need to chuck that in at the end for no reason.
Maybe just a vague reference to another company and not specifically name it. Is that what you mean, Nick?
Well, I'm only going to say that, I think they added it in Separate Ways originally because they had plans as to what they were going to do roughly with Wesker, and they thought, he's just going to work for another company and we'll do it like that. We don't know when the remake train is ending. We don't know if Remake 5 is going to happen. And the history suggests they're just going to leave everything vague. So I just wouldn't be surprised. It only comes up because Ada monologues at the end, doesn't it? She just goes, we'll soon see him again.
I was just going to say, it almost feels like they keep the remakes intentionally vague because they, A, don't know if they're going to continue, and B, almost certainly do know they're going to continue, and they don't want to make
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say, and then that's why I don't think that it would have, like, as John was saying with the Code Veronica thing, I think they would try and intentionally keep that vague because they don't want to have something that contradicts should they make a Code Veronica remake down the path, but if they don't, then it's not going to impact either, so, yeah. The only other bit that makes me curious about it is the whole 7 HCF reference, because that's a RE Engine game that makes a reference to an old, in canon thing. So I'm going to be interested to see if that has to be reworked somehow as well. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, Remake 4 was the grand opportunity to just reimagine the rival company as HCF. All they had to do was just chuck that in a file, and
they still might.
Hurt were healed.
Yeah, well, hopefully they still will, because it's the perfect opportunity to explain who the rival company are and Wesker's role within them and Ada's role within them. But I think they'll absolutely mention Tricell. I think the reason it was kept so vague in the original is because they didn't know where they were going to go. But now it's all pre-written. Whether they remake Resident Evil 5 or they don't, the story's going to lead to Tricell. So it makes sense to me to name them outright, because I imagine we'll get a revised version of Ada's report in some capacity. And we've already seen Excella and a picture of the Sun Garden, so I don't see why they wouldn't mention Tricell, personally.
Just briefly, just going to one side for a moment, Excella's appearance in that cutscene is surprising to me because of all the things that I think like a remake of 5 would reimagine. I always felt Excella would be dramatically redone.
She possibly still could. Realistically, what we were looking at on those images was existing art.
Yeah, absolutely. But it kind of locks something in, doesn't it? unless they patch it.
It
or
locks
something like
an
that.
idea in. But, I mean, that's like Ada in the remake of 4. In theory, like, characterization is different and has a slightly different look, but in theory is still the same character. And so if they went down a line where she looked slightly different but still was enough of the character, like Leon looks, it's still Leon. Like, he's not exactly the same as the original 4 Leon, but he still looks like Leon. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's just a version. So I think it's not that important in the scheme of things. Like, Wesker still looks like Wesker, even though he looks slightly different. He still looks enough of the character that you understand who it is straight off the bat. Yeah, it's kind of a weird one in that regard. I think the thing that's got me, the more we've talked about this, is just how casual now we're just like, so when the next remake happens, or games they it's really, compared to what you were talking about before, Sean, with like 7 years ago, listening to that Resident Evil 2 review, it's like, we've just gotten super casual. If they remake Code Veronica or 5, will they do this? Will they remake 1? Will they remake 0? What will they do next? Like,
I've said on the Discord, so it's kind of printed online, that I'll leave the podcast to when they announce Resident Evil 5 because I've just got nothing more to offer. I can't be enthusiastic or positive. And if they ever do get there, just fucking get on with Resident Evil 6 then. Just do it. Just fulfill your journey, Capcom. just do it. Just get it out of your system so we can finally fucking move on. And then all they'll do is just announce a Resident Evil 2 remake again.
No, because by then enough time's passed that they can remake Resident Evil 7 and then Resident Evil 8 and then remake Resident Evil 2 again.
I cannot commit to this conversation without literally my brain liquefying and pouring out my ear.
Is it too late to crack a beer at this time?
There have been several already.
Just take comfort in the fact that Remake 4 is completely non-canon because the bell tower in the village is still standing in Umbrella Corps.
Yeah.
So there you go. Case closed.
That does bring us nicely, actually, on to another element of the lore that we aren't going to talk about too much in this podcast because we're saving it for a future podcast later on in the year. But it's the overall position with the canon. Specifically the remake canon, and there's been some discussion and some up-to-date interviews, should we say, and comments from Capcom, and we'll talk about it in a lot more detail at another time, but it does raise the question about where this fits, if at all. And I think we've spoken earlier about how perhaps what the quote-unquote true version of events is becoming less and less important. And as long as all the big bits kind of happen, then it's fine. And then you can kind of go, well, I prefer Remake 1, or I prefer Remake 2's interpretation over OG, so that's fine. It does everything I need it to line up with Resident Evil 6. For example, and that's fine. I think when we had kind of Alex on, and we mentioned comments, in the past as well about how almost laissez-faire the Japanese tend to be about if things don't quite match up continuity-wise. It's like, it doesn't, whatever. It is what it is kind of scenario. I think we're seeing that more and more with Capcom, certainly with this franchise. I just wonder, because in the past, they've placed such a strong emphasis on the storyline. It's been a huge, it's certainly one of the major reasons why I still play the games today, and certainly through the dark period from 4 to 6, from my point of view anyway, because I didn't really replay a lot of the games as they were coming out. It's that kind of bombastic nature of bioterrorism, the slightly over-the-top heroes, but it's also that sinister horror element behind it, and there was that cohesive storyline and structure going through with a clear point from A to B. Now, whether that was always intentional, I think it was, and I think the kind of supplemental material that's kind of come about in the last 10 years or so really does shine a light on how much thought and effort goes into making these games, in trying to make it work and be as realistic as it can be within the confines of its own genre. I can't help but feel a lot of it is a bit lost, and as someone who is a dedicated new canon fanatic for Star Wars, I get a bit put off when Dave Filoni messes up with the canon in The Mandalorian, which he does occasionally.
I've never considered that before, Nick, that when it comes to Resident Evil, I know you very much appreciate the Prime timeline, but then with Star Wars, you very much embrace the new.
It's only because that's when I had the opportunity to get into it.
And do you have a choice now? You don't have have a choice because they've made a definite. There's a difference there that with Star Wars that they've made a definite point of going. There's the old universe, and that's still there. It exists as it was, but it's not being touched anymore. But going forward, we're only going to this, and that doesn't mean we can't pull from those bits in the past because they obviously do. But like, yeah, there's a difference there. This is where I was about to say, which is like there are two facets that people need to keep aware. One is that people confuse canon with events. Canon and events are not necessarily the same thing. Canon is a concept of consistent tone and consistent narrative and consistent events. Nick, your video that you did, I always mention the video because it's a great example of it. It's like Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 remakes, they hit the narrative beats that would be consistent to the original as far as a base canon. Like, this happens, this happens, this happens. 4 does the same. The events do change, but the narrative doesn't change. The events are what changes, and the way that they're structured is what changes. And people sometimes conflate the two together as a problem when that's not necessarily the case. For example, with Resident Evil 2 Remake, do I lament that Leon and Claire do not communicate as much as they do in the original? Yes, it's terrible. The narrative structure changes, but does it change the dynamic between the characters? No. No, it doesn't. The narrative that they go through individually as characters stays consistent, and that is canon. That thing is no different, and people need to remember that sometimes you can keep canon with change. And obviously people love to point out, oh, Resident Evil 1 didn't have canon because you had multiple versions of the same events, and it wasn't until later that narrative was created. And that's also true. That's not a fact you can deny, but it doesn't necessitate that it's a problem because the events can change. So Remake 1 kind of tells the same events but with some changes, and it doesn't make any major impact. 4 is kind of like that now because fundamentally we can pick at all the things that have changed minorly that have knock-on effects to other canon or other events per se, but it doesn't fundamentally change that the story of it actually hasn't changed at all. Like, Leon is still going in to rescue the president's daughter. There's still a nefarious plot by the Los Illuminatus for why they've kidnapped the president's daughter. All those things have changed. It's just the details that have been altered. So yeah, you have to be aware that I think what they're doing in Japan is they go, right, we at least hit the bits that are important, but how we get there and how the details are don't seem to matter as much. And that obviously infuriates people that are very much canon focused and want these details to line up perfectly consistently, whereas other people might just be like, the base stuff matches. The other part of it for me is that, how do I explain this? I had a thought process and now it's gone because I've gone into too much about canon, but it's like the thing I think that's changed is twofold, and we've talked about this before. Once Wesker was gone in the original timeline, the narrative cohesion of Umbrella had gone, Wesker had gone. So you didn't have a big bad anymore. So you have to start creating new stories, and it became almost like I don't want to say villain of the week thing, but it was, like every game had a new enemy, a new company, a new organization, a new virus, a new outbreak, a new Plaga, whatever it was. So the games themselves started to pull away from needing narrative connectivity. Additionally, the people working on them were not working under the auspicions of what the original games were. So we had the original Resident Evil, Biohazard, and then obviously we all know that there was 1.5. And one of the criticisms when they had that reviewed, they brought in, so what was the name, John, remind me, the writer they brought in? My brain's gone blank.
Oh, Sugimura.
Sugimura, thank you. They brought Sugimura in, and his thing was, why is this disconnected? You've got a perfect opportunity to continue this narrative because the narrative of 1.5 was basically standalone. Umbrella was involved, there were zombies, but there was no connective tissue to tie it to the original game. So he said to them, you need to have something to tie it. So that's how Claire Redfield was created, because he said, and you need to connect this more to the mansion incident. And so that was the draw card of basically the flagship era, was that every narrative point kind of had a continuation from the previous title they'd worked on. There was always that connective tissue to them. Whereas that's not going on anymore. Like, they've got different writers. We know this. They've got different writers writing on these games. We know that there's the remakes, so they've got the opportunity to go back and just reimagine because they want to make something pointedly different. And they've said this in the roundtables and all that sort of stuff, that they said the original game exists. We don't want to make a one-for-one remake, exactly the same. We want to do something different and interesting with it. And so their own options have changed. So internally we know that's different. So it's hard. Those things are never going to match up. So that's why I don't sit here and get too surprised when I find character motivation has changed, even if the outcome's the same, or the details of information has been improved or reduced. And that's when people get upset. They get upset about, this content was cut. Well, this was missing. It's just like, well, did it matter? Like, yeah, it sucks on one level. I don't not get it. Like, I really would have liked to have seen a reimagining of the clock tower section in Resident Evil 3 Remake. But narratively, does it change? No. Jill still gets infected. Things still happen the way they did in the original. They're just slimmed down. And is it worth getting that upset about? I can't say yes or no. It's individual take. Personally, I'm like, it's disappointing, but it's not the end of the world.
For the most part, Rob, I 90% agree with that, but I just cannot be on board with Dead Factory being replaced by Nest 2. And I can't even dumb it down to Jill fights Nemesis, Jill wins. There's too much lore, too much attached to Dead Factory.
I think that's the thing that perhaps these remakes do crime on, is the visual lore. You know what I mean? Like, it's all narrative beats, and the continuity of the narrative in cutscenes and story stays the same, but the visual storytelling and visual history has changed drastically. And I think that's the thing that all the remakes do, all three of them do.
Yeah.
And Dead Factory is a perfect example. I was disappointed by that. I was disappointed. I mean, I'm upset about that. I'm upset about the railgun being turned into a giant finger. Like, it's silly. I think it was changes that were unnecessary, and it is probably one of the major changes, especially in 3, which I think we'd all admit is probably the weakest of the remakes, and as far as what it remakes and what it changes, it changes the most.
I mean, the thing was, with Remake 3, I was on board all the way up till Jill arrived at Nest 2, and then I was just like, this is just bullshit, this is just nonsense. And then
too modern, doesn't fit, yeah.
Yeah, and that's when
I was
you
the
get
same with
the revelations with Nikolai as well. You know, Nikolai is working for a third party where he didn't originally, and it's just like, oh, this is just,
It's too much. Well, I think I was the same with 2. Like, the modern lab just didn't fit the vibe of the OG. And it does change somewhat narratively how the lab is presented, because as Nick pointed out in that video I'm going to refer to again, it's like in the original, the lab was hidden and it was a really weird like setup to be hidden, to put it through the sewers, and like only certain people knew about it. But the lab in the remake is like known, and you can access it with a visitor's security band, and like, you know, all that narrative setup of like the stuff with Irons that was related to him having to protect, you know, Birkin and all that, it kind of loses its impact when you know the lab is so easily accessible. You know, so that's where I think the world building narrative changes. But again, like, that's where Capcom's obviously gone, we don't really care about that as much. We're going to hit the beats that are the canonical beats that need to be hit, and everything else is superfluous. And I think it's a shame. I mean, I'm not saying that's a good thing either. I think it's a shame personally, but I can kind of understand it.
As Alex Anil sort of told us when he guested on the podcast a while ago, was that we in Western territories care far more about the wider lore and things like that.
The where, why, how.
Yeah, he's a native fluent Japanese speaker, and he's obviously spoken to a lot of people over there. And if there is a canon issue or continuity problem, you know, to the Japanese, you know, sort of the originally written version of the game, if there's a problem, that's just how it is. And we just carry on. We just kind of go, yeah, okay, it doesn't fit. We just move on, and we're not bothered.
Yeah, and they just find a way to just move forward with it, and as long as it vaguely heads in the right direction, it seems to be fine.
Yeah,
like, we don't care about the net powers.
We sit here crunching. Well, why doesn't this exact footstep link in with the, you know, the...
I feel sorry for people like John, because and I'm not meaning this in like, you know, you don't need my massive sympathy for something, but I know that he spent hours working on a timeline that actually kind of worked, and then when you start adding all these new games, those details no longer line up, or you have to start going, what can I take and what can't I take away from this that adds to the lore and adds to the information. But again, that's it. Lore is not canon. This is where I think I was trying to head. It's like, lore is lore. Sometimes lore is not canon. Canon is canon because it just sets an established through line. But lore can change because it can be retconned, it can be adjusted, it can be embellished, it can be retracted, it can be whatever it wants to be, because things constantly move. Like, yeah, it's kind of a weird way to describe it. I don't know if that makes sense, but to me it does. I don't know if it makes sense to anyone else.
Part of the problem for me is I think a lot of people get confused between canon and continuity, which are two different things. Yeah. Canon, like you say, it's a through line. It links everything together, the narrative, how it works, etc. Whereas continuity is all about establishing consistency, the visual ties between games, and that's something that's never really bothered me in terms of canon. Nest and the lab from the first game, yeah, it's irritating that Nest doesn't resemble the lab from the original game, but in terms of canon, they're meant to be one and the same. So I can accept that. It doesn't bother me.
Lab.
Yeah, it doesn't bother me. It's just the continuity isn't there, and that's a different thing. And I think a lot of people get confused by those two terms.
And that's the thing that bothers me more, is I like continuity in things for a reason, you know?
Yeah. But when the RPD in 3 doesn't exactly match up with how it is in other games, that's not a canon problem, that's a continuity issue.
And a great point of that, and a good reason to bring that up, is that that's always been the case. In Resident Evil 3 OG and Resident Evil 2 OG, the situations that line up don't fully line up. There are things that just don't work time-wise, but you just accept them because it's gameplay elements, like they had to border up an access, require access for Jill to get into certain bits. And then when you go there, when you're playing that in Resident Evil 2, the access problems don't exist. Why do you have to redo a puzzle, or why do you have to do... Because it's gameplay. It's because it's the game access part of the game. It's not because that's canon. It's not a canon thing at all. And it's like when people say, characters had to repeat the same puzzles in the same areas in the same narrative, even though they're happening at the same time. It's like, no, that's just gameplay. That's...
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such an odd thing that people get these things mistaken and quite wound up about.
The broken window.
Oh, yeah, broken window is a perfect example. Yeah, exactly. Someone made a mistake. Does it matter? Does it change anything? Not at all.
I think that's quite a handy little preview, I think, of what we're going to kind of be discussing, talking about in our Remake Reflections podcast, where we're going to be looking back at all the kind of remakes and just trying to see what the difference is between them. Is there anything people can do to help relieve their stressful minds as to what is the, as I say, quote-unquote truth of the situation? And, we've touched on there about, for me, I like to know Jill did this or Leon did that, and you can play a version of that canon. And that's where I've struggled a bit. So we're going to kind of really dig into that and see if we do have ultimately a different continuity, different timeline that exists, and do they separate, do they divulge, do they join up again? They're the kind of things we're going to look back on in the future, so stay tuned for that. But that will be towards later in the year. So that does finish our lore discussion of Resident Evil 4 Remake. I've very much enjoyed it. I think we had really a deep dive there into a lot of the changes, and I hope everyone has enjoyed it. We now turn our attention to this podcast edition of Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
Do you know your G virus from your C virus? And your Jabberwock from your Bandersnatch? Or perhaps the number of bombs that appear on the Made in Heaven vest?
Jesus Christ. What kind of fucking question is that?
I'm getting a big fat zero this week.
Yeah, I'm not going to get any of these.
We've talked about the games straying too far from the origins. This Resident Evil quiz, we're now getting Spice Girls as the correct answer. I mean, it's time to quit.
This is Neptune's Biohazard Quiz. Batman. Star Tyrants. George Trevor. Robbie the Precker. Mr. Spencer. Neptune's Biohazard Quiz.
So, quick 5 questions for everyone. We are going right across the spectrum here of Resident Evil. 5 questions I've put together so you can clear your desktops. You can open up Notepad if you need it. Here we go. Question number 1. What does the S stand for in the original Resident Evil 4 if you unlock all the costumes? This is an achievement question, ladies and gentlemen. I've never done one before. Question number 2. What colour is the iris in the glass eye item in Code Veronica? Quite a cool item. What colour is the iris? Question number 3. What throwing item does David have at the start of each of his scenario in Outbreak? Question 4. A welcome return of the odd one out round. Oh, yes.
Oh, no.
No, this is fun. This was fun. Okay, so which one of these does not appear as a treasure in Revelations 2? Topaz, Ruby, Diamond, or Jade? And finally, question number 5. Remake 4 question. What type of beetle can you encounter in Remake 4 in-game and as a charm on your briefcase?
After all she's been through, she's trying to make up for what happened to her.
You mean how Wesker brainwashed her and made her come after us? No one's blaming Jill for that.
No one. Except Jill.
Dr. Taylor?
Yes, we need him in custody ASAP.
I checked the DNA we got from a bite wound on an orca carcass.
It had a strain of T virus in it. You're kidding.
I found the connection between the folks that were infected. They all visited Alcatraz recently.
Well, Dr. Taylor, it's time we debuted our creation.
God damn it!
They turn fast and without being bitten.
I'm Rebecca. What do you want me to tell them?
Someone accessed the DoD's server. They managed to steal data on Leon, Jill, Chris, and Claire.
You think this might have something to do with the Operon now?
Most likely.
I'm going to use my virus to clean the slate.
Dylan!
Suckers, you're nothing more than pawns. That can't be good.
Biohazard, Death Island.
Definitely going on vacation after this.
They're the 5 questions. Let's see how well everyone has done. So question number 1. What does the S stand for in the original Resident Evil 4? If you unlock all the costumes, Rob's seen confidence, so we'll come to him last. Batman, did you know?
And this is in relation to the costumes.
Yes, it's an achievement if you unlock all the costumes.
Oh, God. Absolutely no idea. Suits you, sir.
Suits you. Okay. Stars Tyrant, did you know?
Socialist? I had no idea.
So the S stands for socialist. You're going to kick yourselves because I think Romby knows it, Rob.
Stylish.
Stylish.
Oh,
Of course it does.
The S stands for stylish.
Yes, which could be a nod back to one of the...
sorry, Dante.
Stylish RE4. Yes, there we go. Question at number 2. What is the colour of the glass eye item in Code Veronica? Batman, it's your favourite game.
Do you know, I can't even remember a glass eye being in Code Veronica.
Oh, no.
It's the Doctor statue, and they have in the battle game Wesker stares at it as a bonus. It's
a great moment in the game.
There's no great moments in that game. I've no idea. Green.
Green eye. Okay, Stars Tyrant, did you know?
It's like something like orange or yellow. I'll go orange.
Orange. Okay. Romby?
I think it's blue.
Is blue? It is. It's just a standard blue. Nothing special. There we go. Well done, Romby. Question number 3. What throwing item does David have at the start of each of his scenarios? Or when you play as David? Romby?
Is it a knife? I have no idea.
Knife?
I'm going to go with knife. It just seems like a throwing item.
It is a throwing, absolutely. Stars Tyrant?
Wrench.
Oh.
Batman?
Yeah, wrench.
It is.
Oh, it makes so much more noise.
It does make Monkey wrench.
As soon as he said it, I was like, I can see the artwork of him standing with the wrench.
Yes, he has this collection of 12 monkey wrenches. There you go, which you could use.
The different sizes, clearly.
David King.
Legend. Question number 4 was the odd one out question. So which of these treasures does not appear in Revelations 2? A topaz, the ruby, a diamond, or a jade? Batman, did you know?
I'm pretty sure it's either jade or diamond. I think it's jade. I don't recall jade in Revelations 2.
Okay, Stars Tyrant?
I said jade as well. Yeah, I don't remember it.
Okay, Romby?
I've gone with jade as well.
It's correct. It is Jade, because Jade's obviously a character in Netflix. But there we go. No, correct. Topaz, ruby, and diamond.
God. I will give you credit for that one because that one fits.
He just cannot wait to link these fucking things in, can he?
But I will give him that because they do have jade treasures in other Resident Evil titles. So, I'll give him that.
Was the answer Tyler Hamilton, Nick?
Researching into this, there's actually a remarkable consistency in a lot of the games. The Topaz, Ruby, Diamond, and Emerald is the other one. Appears in Revelations 2 and in RE5 as well, so there's quite a lot. There we go. Question number 5 was what type of beetle can you encounter in Remake 4 in-game, but also as a charm on your briefcase? Last time, did you know?
I just went for Scarab. It's the only thing I think of.
Scarab Beetle makes sense. Batman.
Yeah, I think it's a scarab beetle. It's on the wall of the castle in the courtyard behind that fountain thing.
Mm-hmm. Romby?
Rhino.
Well, someone has been paying attention. Romby is absolutely correct. It is a rhinoceros beetle.
Bollocks.
The giant horn.
Yes, it's like a stag beetle, but the claw's the other way around. So let's have a look at those final scores. Wow. This podcast winner with a mightily impressive 4 out of 5. It's Romby. Well done, sir.
Yeah, I'm quite happy with that one.
Yeah, very impressive. And joint second, Sean, you'll be delighted. Joint second with 2 points. So well done.
Shove your quiz up your arse, Nick. No law questions in a law-themed podcast. Disappointing.
Yeah. Fuck you, Nick.
That's why I think I did so well, because it's like attention to detail in the game universe, not in items, not in the law.
I like to keep you on your toes. Keep you on your toes. So congratulations, Rob. That does finish our quiz for this time. So join us next time when we'll have some more questions.
I'm disappointed. I'd studied mid-2000s phones for no reason.
Very good. So we are rapidly ending episode 87. I think it's been it's an interesting discussion and more to come. More to come, as I said. You can look forward to a Remake Reflections podcast later in the year. But coming up next, oh yes, we go back to the murky world of Dead Aim. Yes! For Resident Evil Dead Aim is 20 years old. 20 years old. I mean, I don't want to make everyone seem old, but it is 2 decades old. And we need to celebrate this event, so we will be, with a kind of retrospective happy birthday podcast. And to help that, we're going to be doing a lore stream on our YouTube channel at some point, where our resident Twitcher, Stars Tyrant, you're going to be streaming the game beginning to end. You've been experimenting with mouse controls and every form of controls.
Yeah, we should be pretty much solid on the day, but I love the game. For me, obviously, it comes full circle because it was my first ever appearance on the podcast. Was the Dead Aim episode. So the fact that we're celebrating 20 years of this title, which is one of my favourites in the series, and I say that with no exaggeration or anything, I love the title. We'll try and get this off the ground. The idea is I will play it, and the other guys who are here with me today will be your hosts, and we'll be there to engage with the chat and things like that. So I hope everyone can join us. It's going to be a fun evening. I like to think I've got Dead Aim down to the point where I won't die hilariously badly on stream. But, you know, if you're there and you see it, it's going to be a great experience too. So hope you can join us.
Yes, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel then, and then you'll know when we're going live for that. But we'll try and keep everyone posted. But what's great about Dead Aim is that for such a simple spin-off, there's an awful lot of lore going on. There's loads of mentions. We've got the Nemesis lab, the 6th lab. We've got really obscure timeline dates as to when things happen. Talking about Morpheus' dismissal, why he was dismissed, creation of Pluto, what's going on at the benthic labs. There's all sorts of things. That, it's good. It's deep.
And sort of from Code Veronica to Umbrella's End, it's the only real entry we have with the wider lore. You know, there's a big void in the timeline, and Dead Aim is the only game that kind of fulfills any entry, if you like.
Absolutely, and very much looking forward to it. So that will be coming up, and obviously following that, we'll probably should be hitting the Death Island review as well. So plenty to look forward to. On that note, I'd like to thank everyone for listening, and it's goodbye from me, Neptune.
Goodbye from me, Batman.
Goodbye from me, Stars Tyrant.
And goodbye from me, Romby. Shot, gun to gunshot.